All right, welcome. This is another installment of Jay's Analysis. Today we have David, the Real Med White, joining us again. We did a great discussion last time of Oriental so-called Orthodoxy, the problems there, and I think David broke it down in a professional manner. David, welcome back. Thank you for coming back to Jay's Analysis.
Yeah, it's great to be back, and I'm pretty glad to be here again, just making more videos.
Yeah, you've been killing it, dude. All your videos have been solid. I've been sharing. The Diophysitism one was really good. Want to make sure everybody, can everybody hear him okay? Can you guys hear
Testing.
David?
Can you guys hear me?
We should be
Is
good.
my voice perfect?
Is his voice soothing you?
A lot of people will notice that I have a better mic now.
It does. It sounds great.
Yeah.
Is it a McDonald's drive-through head attached microphone? Is that what you're doing now?
Yeah, it's a blue McDonald's Yeti. It's got them French fries on the top.
Okay, so we want to order an order of monophrysism. A double order of monophrysism. That was really stupid. All right, so today the discussion is the traps, right? We've done a lot of talks on theology. Oh, y'all, you talk about theology. You don't ever talk about practical stuff. Well, today we're going to talk about practical stuff. I'm going to talk about all the mistakes that I made, the many, many, many mistakes that I've made. David's going to talk about mistakes he made. We're going to talk about the traps that you're going to encounter if you get into theology, if you get into reading the Bible, if you get into Orthodoxy, especially people that are notorious, people to avoid. We're not going to be naming every single person that I've had a dispute with. That's not the point here. The point here is to point out the errors to avoid. We'll be mentioning some of the more prominent people, but David, tell us about your channel. I've got you linked below. We got probably some new people who don't know about you. But this discussion is going to be more practical. It's totally going to be practical. We're going to talk about the focus of prayer life, that kind of stuff, how that is the key to avoiding a lot of these traps. Tell us about your channel and let's kick us off here.
So, in case some of you there don't know me, I'm David, the Real Med White. I basically do kind of apologetics, but my main aim for my YouTube channel is explaining Orthodox concepts, whether it's theology, whether it's practice in a basic manner. So basically hard to understand concepts told you in a basic language. There are some videos that I had as kind of off topic, but the main focus of my channel is basically Orthodox theology, and that's what I will describe. I also have a Twitter, although I'm locked. I think I'm locked for 3 more days. I'm locked on Twitter right now, but I also am I tweet regularly about stuff that I found out. Whenever I see something interesting, when I'm reading a book or something like that, I always try to share. Other than that, I just basically post silly stuff there. But yeah, so my YouTube channel is basically
I'll add your Twitter. I forgot about your Twitter. I'll add that. Yeah, you've got some good stuff. Your videos have been really kicked up. You've upped your quality. Congratulations on hitting 1,000 subs.
Thank you for sharing my stuff as well, Jay. And for those that kind of want to know what I tackle these days, in particular, I'm tackling Oriental Orthodoxy because there's really not many people that tackle that stuff, and I think the dispute is very interesting, and I think it's something that not a lot of people know about. And
it's a question that always comes up too. Questions are always like, well, wait a minute, what about Oriental Orthodoxy? How do you know?
Yeah, what about the Council of Chalcedon? You guys are an historian. That kind of silly basic apologetics that we have. And I also make videos about Roman Catholicism. I also make videos about Orthodox theology itself. So I have introduction to essence energies distinction. And generally, when I try to make videos, they're not long. They're not Jay is very popular for having 2-hour long detailed videos, whereas I kind of try to keep it simple. I make videos 10 minutes, 20 minutes. So for those with a short attention span like myself, my channel might be a blessing for you.
Right. Yeah, no, there's a place for all this. And some of your arguments, you come up with stuff I've never heard too. So really good material there. And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe to his channel. I've got it linked there. David, real briefly, there are some people in the chat that are new to your materials. You aren't you're a convert, correct?
Yes, I'm a convert, and yeah, I'm kind of like I'm living in Turkey right now. I've lived here for 10 years, and I have Turkish citizenship. So I'm kind of like already in a very weird spot. I'm a convert, and I'm a Turkish citizen. But I lived in the United States for 1.5 years, and that's when I like started getting into Orthodoxy really. So I'm pretty much familiar with the Orthodox, United States Orthodox, or basically the American Orthodox world. And I've spent 1 year as a catechumen there, and I was baptized there in a Goark church, and I'm back in Turkey, and as usual, I'm going in a certain church here, and just to make sure that some people don't think I'm a crazy person. I did get blessing from my priest, right? So my priest approves me of doing this. He's aware of what I'm doing, and I talked to him about the kind of stuff I cover, and he's completely fine. He gave me his blessing. So I'm not like an individual guy who does this.
You're a LARPer. You're a LARPer. Exposed.
Oh, I'm a LARPer.
We're going to make exposed videos on you now. Exposed.
Yeah. The Turkish agent. LARPing as Orthodoxy
the
to
KGB,
spread Islam.
You're a KGB Turkish agent, yeah.
I'm an MIT agent, Turkish MIT agent, making Orthodoxy look bad and cause schisms in Christianity. Yeah. That's my objective.
What you get paid to do, yeah. All right. You're going to kick us off with the topics. So you've got a list of things that you want to discuss that you see as the traps and the dangers, the warnings, the temptations. I remember it makes me think of Pilgrim's Progress, the Bunyan allegory, where he's talking about how the Christian life is this kind of like this journey, and there's the slough of despair, and there's these different allegorical places that the Christian encounters on his journey, and there's all these temptations. And I was thinking how what we're doing today is kind of like an Orthodox version of John Bunyan's allegory of the Christian life, except for the Orthodox in our day, where there's these curious temptations that are peculiar to, number one, people coming into Orthodoxy or people new to reading the Bible and this kind of stuff. So let me start it out, actually. I want to say that because there are a lot of people who might be, we want to get them to Orthodoxy, but maybe they just started reading the Bible or something like that. And I would say that when I was a Protestant, that was what I did. I just picked up the Bible, I started reading it, and I assumed, for example, that like when I read the Beatitudes and I read some of the Psalms, that I knew the Bible. And I didn't know what I was talking about. I had no idea what I was talking about. And so one of the early mistakes that I made when I was 19, I started reading the Bible, was that when I read the New Testament, when I got to Acts, I saw these things happening in Acts that I thought were charismatic gifts. And so I was like, well, I guess I need to stop going to a Baptist church. I should go visit the charismatic church because they at least do and believe the things that are in the book of Acts. And Baptists don't even do this. Little did I know, I had no idea what I was talking about, and that charismaticism is not what's happening in the book of Acts, right? So I had a basic kind of misunderstanding where I thought I knew what I was talking about. I thought I understood what I was reading, and I didn't, and I had to be humbled eventually and realize, oh, actually, the book of Acts is not talking about what these crazy charismatics are doing, and so that led me to reading more about church history. And the point I'm making here is just to kind of start off this talk, if maybe you are a non-denominational person or you're a Baptist or something like that, which I was, is that the Bible isn't a book that comes to you out of a vacuum. It's part of a liturgical tradition, a worship tradition. So the Bible has to be understood within the context of the historical church, because it comes to you from a specific historic church from the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And that 1,000 years of Christianity is Orthodox Christianity. So if I were to kick this off, I would kick it off by saying that if you're a Protestant, the thing that I would look for is the fact that the Bible has to be grounded in the liturgical worship tradition of the church, because that's where it comes to us from.
Yeah, and I guess what I was planning on with this discussion as well is that I was planning on starting with general advice, and this is not in a particular order. It's kind of random, but I think there are a lot of good stuff to take from it. And a lot of this stuff that I'm going to be talking about, not all, but a lot of it is it's basically going to be me speaking to myself 2-3 years ago, basically. Stuff that I did that was completely idiotic and that I should never do again. And I see a lot of people do these things, commit these mistakes, and I want them to basically not do so. These are common traps that people fall. So right off the bat, I'll just start with one of the this is a huge pet peeve of mine, because again, I used to do this all the time, and that is this is particular for the catechisms and inquiries, but can even apply to baptized Orthodox Christians who are kind of baby-like in the faith. Um, you, I will kindly advise you to stop constantly getting into debates, whether you're going to Discord debate servers and constantly trying to debate with people about something. Now, debate is good. We're not counter-signaling debate here. That's not really what I'm doing. What I'm talking about is that there are certain people who haven't even read the Bible, who haven't even read a single church father, trying to go and get into debates because they heard certain arguments and they sound very convincing. Right. So one of them will be essence energy's distinction. Let's use that as an example. So let's say they've watched my essence energy's introduction video and they're like, whoa, this is so convincing. I'll just use these arguments and debate people like online. But then they hear certain arguments that Roman Catholics will use, and they have no response to it. So what ends up happening is that because they don't know what they're talking about, they end up having to do two things. First, they either accept that they really don't know much and they start researching more seriously, or two, they just blindly defend what's going on. And three, this is I said two, but it's actually three. Or three, they fall into despair. They're like, oh, I thought this was the unbeatable argument, but actually it's completely beaten. And and the problem is that a lot of people have a lot of issues like these have a lot of nuance. And if you try to just ignore the nuance, it just ends up being a competition of quote mining, and there's no substance in that. So I will recommend people, like, instead of a lot of people spend a lot of time debating. You can use that time debating by actually just reading the church fathers themselves directly. And there's a lot of sources online. You can listen to either Jay or me or any other people that I will be recommending and we will be recommending later on in this stream. And that will be time better spent because you're going to be learning a lot more. Although what's really important about learning a lot more, this is something that I personally found out, is that one of the biggest sins that we have is pride. And so from what I've observed, God will indeed actually make you kind of stupid if you're very open to being prideful, right? So unless you attain humility, God will not allow you to basically learn more stuff, because when you learn more stuff, you end up being more prideful, and then that just ends up in worse scenarios, right? And so that's also, I will say, a very important thing. When there's a lot of church fathers, spiritual fathers, focusing on the sin of pride, and they focus on it for a very, very good reason. It's not just for empty talk. There's a very good reason why pride is such a huge sin to tackle. And
that's a good one.
The sin of heresy in its foundation is pride, right?
Exactly.
It comes from pride. And this is, I think, very important to understand for a lot of newcomers, to avoid pride, to avoid trying to always get into debates. Take it slow, right? Patience is a virtue. A lot of people have a very long time ahead. Most of the people we're talking about is 20 years old, some of them 30 years old, some of them 40 years old. And I will say all of them, they have a very long time ahead of them. So it's good to take things slowly, reading the Bible. Reading the Bible slowly or reading the church fathers slowly, there's no problem with that. Like, learning about things slowly. I mean, Jay, you yourself, I think you've spent like 10 years discerning Orthodox and basically being in that realm, if I'm not wrong. So like, you will be a very good example of taking things slowly. I mean, you came to the place you are right now. You have, a lot of stuff about Orthodox, and I'll basically say that, taking, if someone takes things too fast, they end up in silly, either non-canonical groups, or they just end up losing their minds.
Yeah, no, and I did a lot of things wrong. I had all those similar temptations. I was the two things that I would tell a catechumen nowadays, or if I could talk to myself when I first started looking at Orthodoxy, back in 2007, 2008, I would say you need to relax. You need to be patient, and you don't know what you're talking about. Because I thought I knew what I was talking about, because I had read a lot of Aquinas, I'd read a lot of the Reformers, and I'd read a lot of church fathers even by that time. But I didn't really understand these very nuanced theological disputes that relate to the history of the Trinity, Christology. I thought I did. and I was starting to get into the scratching the surface of that stuff. But it was just a lot of intellectualism, a lot of pride. That's obviously a temptation for any of us who love theology or who love philosophy. You can always be tempted with that. But what I did learn in waiting, 10 years or so before coming into the Orthodox Church was that there was a whole lot of stuff that I really didn't understand. And it took me many, many years to get to the bottom of it, to get answers. And I had, as you said, I had to be humbled quite a bit. I had to go through personal issues and things in my life that were humbling issues, as will happen with most of us at some point, especially as you get older. And as you learn, as you grow, the more that you learn how much you don't know. And there's a paradox, there's a mystery involved in knowledge, to where the more that you learn, you are learning more, you are coming to know more, and you're at the same time learning how much you don't know. And so that should produce humility. And humility is not being passive. It's not being effeminate. It's not being, fake pious. No, humility is admitting and being honest with yourself before the truth, before God, before facts, before things that you don't know, right? And I've said this many times, but one of the greatest things that ever happened to me, people say, why are you so sort of aggressive with Calvinists or with Catholics? And I say that it's because I had to be aggressively refuted when I was young. When I was a hardcore Calvinist, one of the best things that ever happened to me was going onto a message board back in the Yahoo message boards days of 2002 or 3, somewhere in there. And I remember I thought I had everything figured out because I knew all about presup. I knew all about the transcendental argument, and I'd read all these Calvinists, and I thought I was, the bee's knees. And there was these 2 Catholic dudes who were really well-read in the Church Fathers, and they absolutely demolished me in a debate. And it made me furious. It made me so angry, but it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I realized that I had no idea what I was talking about when it came to the Church Fathers. I mean, I had read a little bit of Augustine, but I didn't know anything about the rest of these Church Fathers. And these guys were just hitting me with, pretty solid patristic research and interpretation, and I was lost. And I couldn't answer what they were saying about the canon of Scripture. And so I was at a juncture there where I could either admit that I had no idea what I was talking about, and that these guys knew more than me, and that I needed to humble myself, or I could be prideful and brush it off and, just lie to myself that I knew what I was talking about when I didn't. So these kind of things come into our lives at times to either take us in a better step, like to God kind of confronting us with our own pride, as you said. And we have to either choose to admit that and repent and go in the right direction, or we can harden our hearts and go in a worse direction. And this is not something unique to when you're young. It can happen at multiple stages in our life. That's why we always have to be open to being corrected.
Yeah, exactly. Now, another thing that I will also, to move on with this, to connect this with something else, is that what's also very interesting, and this is from Evagrius Ponticus, who is condemned in the 5th Council, but he does have certain insights, and one of the insights he has is that a true theologian is the one that prays, and I will pretty much agree with that. I will say that a lot of catechumens, a lot of inquirers, they don't know this. I don't know why people don't alert them to this, but prayer is, I will say, the number one thing that they should be focusing on above all else. Prioritize prayer life before everything. It's because you need to have a certain prayer life, right? Morning prayers, evening prayers, prayers before meal, prayers after meal. Let's say that's kind of like the basic. And you can talk about this with your own priest, right? With your own spiritual father. You have your own church to seek guidance from. But this is very important, because if you start building a habit from this, it will indeed carry on later on in your life. If you don't build up a habit from this, and I unfortunately had a very tough time, still have a very tough time on this issue. If you don't build a habit from the very beginning, you're going to have a very tough time after you're baptized. You're going to have a very tough time actually praying after you're baptized. You're going to have to relearn the whole process. And this is, I will say again, this is very connected to theology. If you want to learn theology, it's not just books, it's not just a bunch of this stuff. It's also about prayer. You need to understand how this theology is connected to our practice, right? Why does it matter that, for example, Christ has a human nature alongside a divine nature? Why does that matter? right? And and you with prayer life, the consequences of it is going to match up. You're going to start understanding how all of these doctrines actually connect with one another. And this is not just intellectual, but also in a deep spiritual way. Your heart will understand it. Your mind will understand it. And it's very important that you try to carry both of them instead of putting all your eggs in the intellectual basket, as a lot of people I've seen try to do. And a lot of people try to put all their eggs in the spiritual basket too, right? There's a lot of people that do that, and they should not do that either. They should be balanced. It's going to be both. It's not just going to be one of them. I can just forget the other one. I can just improve on that later. No, they're both very important, and they're both very instrumental in Orthodox life.
Yeah, I would say if somebody is interested in that, I would recommend getting a prayer book. This one is the one I've had ever since I started looking at Orthodoxy many, many years ago. It's from Transfiguration Monastery. It's this little blue one that I think is really, really good. I actually like it better than the other one because it has a whole bunch of different hymns and prayers. So you have your morning prayers and your midday prayers and your evening prayers, and then all the other prayers like Vespers and the Divine Liturgy and all that, and then the hymns and the Akathist hymns and the small canon to the Theotokos. All that is in there, and you will actually combine your theological knowledge with prayer when you start to learn these things. This is an excellent prayer book. If you don't want to go all out with that, start with one of these little ones. Like, you can get these pretty much anywhere. These little and if you're new to praying, if you're new to Orthodoxy, these will have little kind of pre-written prayers that are great to get used to saying, like prayers to your guardian angel, prayers to your patron saint, the Jesus prayer. All these kind of basic ideas are kind of early on in this little red prayer book, which is pretty popular. You can find that pretty much anywhere, Amazon or any church. But yeah, I think you're right, David, to hammer that home, because that's a mistake I made as a catechumen. I would put reading theology books and all that stuff ahead of prayer. And then that's something that you have to learn the hard way. You have to, like you said, you have to force yourself to reorient things to where you're disciplining yourself to do your morning prayers. If you have, one thing I would say to people who have that specific problem like I had, there's a couple ways that you could actually wean yourself off of theology into prayer, which is there's a couple of these really good books that were put out by, who puts these out? St. Vladimir's and Monastery Books. And one of these is the Holy Fathers on the Psalter, right? So if you want to, let's say you want to go through a psalm each day, well, you pray the psalm, and then you've got the readings from different church fathers and saints that go along with that psalm each day. So that's one way that you could wean yourself off of obsessing over theology books and integrating that into prayer, is the church fathers on the Psalter. Or you can also get this big fat book, which is the Bible and the Holy Fathers for Orthodox, which is the daily readings following the calendar, right? It has all the church fathers readings for that day, or the saints and the biblical readings for that day based on the liturgical calendar. So those are two means by which, if you have the problem of too much theology, of integrating the theology into the liturgical rhythm of the church and the Psalms. David?
Oh, sorry, I muted my mic accidentally. I was gonna say that this is gonna be a shameless self-plug, but I do have a video on this topic on basics of prayer. But and I also talk about a lot of the sources that you can use for prayer. There's a website called Horologion. So it's in that video. It's in the description of that video, that has like the daily prayers, including the hours and the prayers dedicated for that day. But when you're doing all of this stuff, you should seek spiritual guidance from your own church. And talking about these things with your priest is very important, because he's going to understand you much better than we can understand any of you. In all honesty, he's
That's
going
the next
to know
point. That's the next point. Yes, to talk about how this can't be an online LARPing thing, right?
Exactly. This can't just be online. This has to be a real thing. You have to really go to church regularly, and you have to have a good relationship with your spiritual father, with your church. If you're baptized with your godparent, if you're not baptized with a prospective godparent, these are very important things. These are very, very important because this is how people became Orthodox in the 4th century, in the 5th century. This is the process that people became Orthodox. It's not, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have the select works of the church fathers. It's really all of this. It's them talking with their priests. It's them seeking spiritual guidance. It's them having spiritual guidance from reliable laymen in their own church. Not to say that every single layman is reliable, but there's a lot of crazy laymen out there, of course. But this is really how people became better Christians. And we have to replicate that, right? If you want to replicate the early church, we have to replicate the early church in the way they act as well. And I will say this is, again, amongst many of these things, these are very important things. And in the United States, especially, I mean, all around the world, we are pretty much very individualist.
Yeah.
Right. We think of ourselves as individuals first and communities second. No, when you're an Orthodox Christian, even if you're just an inquirer, even if you're just a catechumen, you are part of that church, right? You're part of that body, and not part of the body per se, but rather part of the church that you're attending, right?
Yeah.
And it's very important that you actually try to integrate, and you shouldn't try to just do things. This is something I did myself. Like I just kind of like ignored it. Like I listened to the catechism classes. I attended the classes, but most of the time I was like, oh, I know better. No, I didn't know better. You don't know better. You need to rely on your church, right? You're trying to become part of that church. You have to rely on it. And so integration into the church is very important. We need more people doing that. As I said, and I would like to repeat myself, if you want to be part of the early church, if you want to act like you're part of the early church, you really have to act like you're part of the early church. As I said, all of this stuff, spiritual guidance, this is how people in the early church acted, and you can't ignore that. And yeah, do you have anything to add, Jay?
Yeah, I would. One of the big accusations that we get. So I want to do a little bit of myth busting here in this stream, which is that, oh, you guys are a cult. Well, no, actually, what we do, if you're in my Discord, if you're in our circles, this is an accusation, a false accusation that's bantered around quite a bit. Which it's ironic because what we do consistently is tell people that they have to be part of a local canonical church. Now, obviously, if you don't have one, that's not your fault. You got to do what you got to do. But for those who do have access to, canonical churches, they need to be in there and they need to find a spiritual father. So that's actually the opposite of a cult. Nobody's following me. I'm a layman. I do have the blessing to talk about the things that I talk about, but I'm not your spiritual father. And so we always try to stress in my Discord or any of the areas where we interact with a lot of these people is that I can't fulfill that role for you. That's not my role. So you need to find that in your own life, and hopefully with God's providence and trusting in God, you can find that. It took me many years to find good spiritual father, but eventually I did. And so it'll come. You have to trust God for that. But I would say that it's not correct or accurate to say that what we do or what we're promoting is some sort of weird cult, when we consistently tell people that, number one, I'm not a guru, I'm not your spiritual father, David's not. Nobody online can really fulfill that role. You can have people who help you and point you in the right direction, but you actually need to find that in your own life. So don't mistake me for that, and don't mistake David for that, or anybody else who's doing online apologetics. That's not the job of the apologist. That's why in the church there's a lot of different people, a lot of different ministries, a lot of different roles. And the priests, the deacons, they fulfill that role. Elders fulfill that role. Not me, not laymen. So find that in an actual spiritual father.
And let me see. Let me check my notes because my memory is not perfect. And to connect with this, because there's a lot of people that make this mistake as well. When we're talking about integrating into a church, several people might end up asking, but what about my parish, right? I mean, I go to a certain parish, but my priest isn't perfect. My fellow parishioners, they're not perfect. Well, this is also an important thing because a lot of people they read the saints, they read the church fathers, and they think that people in the church are exactly like the saints and the church fathers. So they are
right.
saints for a very good reason, right?
Yeah.
They're saints because they're pretty much as close to perfection as one could get. And unless you have living saints in your church, you're not really going to get that in church. So when we're making apologetics, especially like, for example, against Roman Catholics and talk about Pachamama and all that silly stuff, when we're talking about that stuff, we're not implying that we're 100% perfect, that we're all living saints and so on. The Orthodox Church does have its fair share of problems. We have problems in parishes. There are issues. So a lot of people, I myself did this beforehand. A lot of people come into the Orthodox Church and they expect like everyone to be 100% perfect, 100% like correct on everything, that they're all like they're all very good spiritually, that they know everything theologically. No, like we need to be realistic. A lot of people, I mean, we're all sinners, right? We all have things that we miss out on. And so expecting that, I think, is that doesn't mean that we're terrible, right? I mean, even the most liberal parishes, when they do liturgy, they're actually doing liturgy, right? They're not worshiping an idol like the Roman Catholics do and other weird sects do.
Yeah,
But,
you're not going to
the
have
point
clown masses, but ultimately at the end of the day, there's no Puritan church, right? There's no perfect Donatist type church. These are mistakes that already came about in the early church, where people tried to have these perfectly righteous sects, the Donatists, the Novatianists, all these different groups were puritanical in their attempt to have not the correct theology per se, but to have actually perfect people. Montanism, right? Tertullian, he fell into this. One of the reasons Tertullian is not a saint is that he fell into this heresy of the Montanists, and he believed that these were the actual, true, perfect, the holy rollers, basically. So you're not going to find that. You're always going to find people that are sinful. This is the idea of the church as the hospital of sinners and not the congregation of the saints, at least the church in history. So to have those kind of expectations are false. There's a lot of traps. What we're going to get to here in a minute is all the different traps that when you're Orthodox, it doesn't end. The grass isn't necessarily greener. But that's the phenomenon that I want to mention there, is that the grass is greener phenomenon. Like, oh, well, there's these problems in Orthodoxy. Maybe this is a temptation for some people, maybe if I go over to Rome, I can avoid these problems. And I can tell you that from experience, you're not going to avoid those problems. It's going to be worse when you go in that direction. So we need to avoid the temptation of the grass is greener phenomena.
Yeah, and a lot of our argumentation depends on our structure, or church structure, or ecclesiology being also superior, right? We have Christ's church, we have Christ's doctrines. Just because we have a couple of people, some of them even being clergy perhaps, being heretical, doesn't mean that the church is suddenly wrong. I mean, it's kind of like the same logic with any heretics in history. So again, it's we had Orthodoxy in its timeline had very diverse things to tackle. This kind of stuff it doesn't mean that, like the problems that we have today aren't bad, but when you put into perspective, there's a lot of very worse things that happen. And one other thing that I want to talk about is that some people do this. I kind of semi fell into this problem, not really, but kind of, is a lot of people look at the churches, like they see Greek Orthodox Church, or they see Russian Orthodox Church, or they see Antiochian Orthodox Church, and they think that like they are ethnic categories that only like people of certain ethnic backgrounds can attend. I can assure you that's not true, especially in the United States, when I would say most churches are at this stage convert churches, right? A lot of the churches here are convert churches. So you will go to, for example, a Greek Orthodox church. The one I went to is basically a half convert, probably even more convert than cradle. And so don't fall into that as well. I mean, right now I could tell you that the church I go to is a Russian church, and like the priests don't know Turkish, so we don't have a common language that we can speak. We can't speak English, we can't speak Turkish to one another, so we have to rely on translators basically. And everyone there is basically Russian or Georgian or one of those other Slavic groups. But I mean, for my personal experience, I don't feel left out. I'm still just as Orthodox as the rest of these people. So a lot of people kind of had that doubt in their mind, and in Orthodox churches, you're generally not going to see that. I've heard some Greek parishes do that philitism stuff. But even that, I will say they're a minority, right? So the majority of the Greek parishes in the U.S., even then, they're like very convert friendly. A lot of them are still convert majority, and yeah, so a lot of people kind of fall into that trap of orthodoxy being too ethnic or whatever. And actually, no, orthodoxy is alive because of the converts. Actually, it's not just because of cradles. Um,
Yeah, I mean, if you like,
and other,
if you go to an Antiochian church in the Bible Belt, it's going to be all a bunch of Anglo, Scotch, Irish converts, and then some black people. And if you go to a Antiochian church in Florida, it's going to be all Arab people. So it really just depends on the location and the local demographics. So yeah, and I've met a lot of converts in different Russian churches. So I mean, I haven't been to a whole lot of Russian churches, but the ones that I have been to, I've met multiple converts there. We've had a lot of people, because of the issues in the church, have to leave the Greeks and come over to the Russian church. So yeah, it's kind of a mix, and there's no one size fits all. But again, yeah, you're going to find these problems, and these kinds of problems are the problems that you actually saw in the early church. The early church, if you read the canons of the councils, from Nicaea to Gangra, from Gangra to Nicaea to Constantinople to Chalcedon, when you read through these canons, you'll find all these kinds of problems popping up, like different ethnicities and different regions having this issue and that issue. So the problems that you see in Orthodoxy, the only reason I'm bringing this up is that it actually demonstrates that the Orthodox Church is the church of the first millennium, is that it's the same problems. We have a lot of the same problems that were being addressed in the canons of the councils, the first 7, 8 councils. So to me, that's a pretty good indicator of which one is the authentic historic church. But yeah, you're never going to get away from problems. You're never going to have the pure church. And that's why we're not Donatists. That's why we're not Calvinists. Calvinists, in many ways, actually fall into this mistake of Donatism. But the purist ideal is also a temptation that we want to talk about for people who convert. So let's talk about the fringe groups. Do you want to move to that? Is that on your list next, or do you got something else?
Yeah. Let me see. That's kind of on. That's pretty much on the next one. One thing I want to mention before we move on to that is that another mention of the word concept fallacy. I know a lot of people are getting their heads drilled in with us repeating that, but it's very important because I've seen a lot of catechumens and inquirers kind of fall into this mistake where they see, like, they will see Origen's terminology, or like the Greek philosophers' terminology being used by church fathers. Now, first of all, I will say it kind of makes sense. They both speak the same language. They're both trying to talk about similar topics. So why is it such a controversy that they use the same terminology? But what happens in the Orthodox Church is that the terminology becomes it becomes transformed, right? So hypostasis is a great example. We had someone in the Discord saying the Orientals are right because hypostasis meant ousia in Aristotle. Yeah, but in the church, it's not.
Yeah,
That's
in
kind of
Basil's
like
letters, it takes on a different connotation. If you read letter 38 of Basil, he makes a distinction between hypostasis and ousia, and he says it's a very important, crucial distinction.
even Saint Kirill, who kind of interchangeably used those two terms at times, still used the Cappadocian version of those terms. So these things, the theological precision, did end up, I don't want to say develop, but they became more precise as time went on. We will agree there. But there's these terminologies, hypostasis, ousia, these terminologies, when we're talking about in the context of Orthodox Christian theology, they have different meanings than what the philosophers meant, right?
Yeah,
They're
this is that's a big mistake I made. This kept me from Orthodoxy for a long time because I thought that what Hellenic philosophers were saying was this. I mean, the meanings were the same. It had to be. How could it be any different? So whatever, if Plato talks about a triad, or if Plato talks about logos, or if Plato talks about any of these terms, or if it's used in Aristotle in a certain way, substance, it must mean the same thing when any church father says substance. But you don't really understand the nuance of this until you get really, really deep into philosophy and theology. And I'm not saying everybody has to do that. I'm just saying that it's very easy to make these kind of mistakes, again, which I made. I thought I thought, well, we believe in natural theology because the term law of nature, natural law, Maximus uses that term, so he must teach natural theology. Aquinas teaches natural theology, so they're all talking about the same thing. No, they're not. Because just because it's the same word doesn't mean that that word has the same meaning. Words can have different meanings in different contexts. And in the realm of philosophy, it can get very nuanced. And so you're absolutely right. With Oriental Orthodoxy, the basis for a lot of that dispute was on the fact that the terms early on had a significance. St. Jerome talks about this. Later, fathers at the councils of the Fifth and Sixth Council talk about this extensively. The terms took on specific meanings in different contexts. And so when the Orientals were using the term hypostasis to mean a concretization of nature, it actually gets nuanced and specified even further as we get into the Fifth and Sixth Councils. And there's a lot of research, a lot of work that goes into that. And it took me many, many years of studying that topic before I grasped that, even terms like logos, right? Logos, this is where E. Michael Jones is specifically wrong. Logos is not an attempt to synthesize Hebrew revelation with Greek philosophy. It's not. Now, sometimes they're talking about the same referent. A word might be referring to the same thing, but that's not the same as melding a Hellenic philosophical system with revelation. They're two different things. And so when the scriptures are using terms like logos, they're appealing to the wisdom text of the Old Testament. They're not trying to say that the Stoics are talking about Jesus. The Stoics aren't talking about Jesus because they didn't know Jesus. Now, in a sense, they did, because all truth ultimately arises from Christ. But we can't take Stoicism and meld that with Christianity. We can't take Aristotelianism and meld that with Christianity in terms of the systems and the way that those systems define those words, because when we do that, that's the mistake of Roman Catholicism. That's where Roman Catholicism went in the wrong direction. If Plato says something right, we can say, yeah, that's right. Oh, but Aristotle was right here. Oh, but Proclus was right here. But Plotinus was right here. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's different than saying that the system that Aristotle lays out of the substance, accidents, dualism, and the Hellenic definition of simplicity in Aristotle, that distinction implies composition or division, those things are impossible in our theology, and they are purged in those 7 councils. You can actually demonstrate very easily that Basil, Chrysostom, Athanasius, St. Maximus, they're actually arguing consistently against Hellenic dialectics. In fact, I just put a quote on the Twitter yesterday where St. Gregory of Nyssa himself is saying that I'm rejecting Origen's Hellenism in this way. We are not Hellenists, he says. We don't follow the philosophers. We follow divine revelation. And that's why we can't synthesize our revelation with pagan philosophy.
Yes, and I believe one small thing that I want to add, just to cover all grounds, is that for all the criticisms that we have for the EP, and I myself have a lot of criticism, you yourself have a lot of criticism. One big mistake that people make is, let's say that you are an inquirer, you want to go to an Orthodox church, and the only Orthodox church you have nearby you is an EP one, right? And I will say, it's better to go there than to just stay at home and not going there, right? At the end of the day, EP churches are still canonical, and even MOSPAT, Moscow Patriarchate, believes, even though they severed communion with EP, they still believe that they have grace, and that they still believe they're part of the church. So even Moscow Patriarchate believes that EP is part of the church. So there's no reason for you to go full extremist and full TO and say, oh no, this is poisoned and I can't go there. I mean, the parish I go is directly under EP. I mean, I live in Turkey. I live in the EP territory, so I kind of have to be under EPs. But you can't separate these two things, right? We don't go full fake Orthodox and this communion is completely poisoned and everyone that's in communion with them is poisoned, and that kind of nonsense. And I think that will connect beautifully with red flags to avoid, and generally groups of people and attitudes that show us that you should avoid these people. And one of them will instantly be the biggest red flag, I will say, is if they're schismatic, if they're uncanonical, if they're part of the so-called true Orthodox or old calendarist churches, stay away from these people, right? They're not just schismatic, although I believe Saint Nicodemus the Hagiorite, I might be wrong, but that's who I remember, said that schism is worse than heresy. Right, so that gives you a double reason to avoid these people, and I will even argue that they're heretical in the basis of them having a heretical ecclesiology. But I'm not going to name names because I don't want to make them popular. But there's a lot of people in these groups that pretend to be Orthodox Christians, and you see them in the theology. They're either like completely Romanidian in the sense that they completely reject Augustine. A lot of fake Orthodox groups, for example, reject that St. Augustine was a saint, right? There's a lot of groups that actually push for that sort of an argument. And generally speaking, you should completely avoid uncanonical groups. They're vipers. Stay away from them. They're never pleasant. They never are pleasant people. And other red flags that
they're also terrible
avoid.
apologists, and they're even though they'll say all day long they're not Donatists, it's really just a rehashing of Donatism, because they have this idea of like the virus ecclesiology that if you're in communion with somebody who violated a canon, then all the grace is gone, and then you lose all grace. It's this it's basically a sedevacantist version of orthodoxy, but it's not really orthodox because they don't even understand like basic theological ideas. They don't know what when we talk about recapitulation, they don't know what we're talking about. They don't understand the specifics of Christology, and that Christology affects ecclesiology. So they actually have a Nestorian, very very rigid view of of ecclesiology, to where all grace is lost in not just in the sense of like if a church adopted a heresy, but they'll actually tend to view canonical violations as if they're divine revelation. But the canons aren't divine revelation. They're supposed to be followed, obviously. But this is the mistake of the Pharisees. The Pharisees viewed in a sense, you could look at the Pharisaic tradition like the church's canon law tradition. And I'm not saying that they're equivalent. I'm just saying, I'm making an analogy. And what does Jesus say? Jesus says that you Pharisees actually at times can put the laws and traditions of men over the revelation of God. And the same thing can happen in any church, right? Roman Catholicism can have the same Talmudic mindset, the same spirit. This is the leaven of the Pharisees that Jesus warned about. And you can have the same spirit of all or nothing sort of rigidity in orthodoxy as well, to where you arbitrarily, no one has grace. My little tiny group alone has grace. And then what happens when your little tiny group of 5 true Orthodox people, then a week later you split and condemn the 3 of your 5 group. You guys split between 2 and 3, and you've condemned them in your little tiny 5 people jurisdictions. I mean, it's a world of madness, and it's a world of nonsense. It actually attracts a lot of unstable people. I'm not trying to say that this proves it. You're being an ad hominem. No, I'm just telling you like my observations of these worlds. And it's very analogous to sedevacantism, where you just have these little tiny fringe sects. They're all the keepers of the true flame, and they all condemn all the other groups. And it's in many ways it's worse than Protestantism. And by the way, most of the world of what's called the Episcopi Vagantes, which is the wandering bishop world, that's full of spooks. It's full of con men, it's full of crooks, and it's full of people with mental illness. I mean, you don't have to believe me. You can study just objective research into from people who've done like history analysis or intelligence analysis of the world of wandering bishops. It's just a bunch of quacks. And so you're just putting yourself into a realm of people that are going to damage you. That doesn't mean that in the canonical world of Orthodoxy that you're going to avoid corruption, or you're going to avoid people who get things wrong, or there's going to be people that wrong you in the churches. There's going to be phonies in the canonical churches, but the grass is not going to be greener in these tiny little fringe Puritan sects.
Yeah, and a great example will be, and I'm not going to name them, but basically the greatest TO channel, and when I say greatest, I mean 600 subscribers. One of their head honchos, when you look at like he's clergy, he's supposed to be clergy, but he has certain uncanonical beliefs, he has certain uncanonical actions. So the 2 examples that I will give, and I don't want to name him because I don't want to make him sad, but one of them will be that he supports Andrew Yang publicly. And you don't have to be a genius to figure out that Andrew Yang is an abortion supporter, right? So you have a supposed clergy supporting a politician that supports abortion, right? So by using their logic, actually, then they are abortionists themselves. And
That's a great point
another,
because their view
yeah,
of like being tainted with the virus of canonical violations. Yeah.
yeah, and one of like a lot of people will say in that world is that we're not really Donatists. I mean, sure, you might not theoretically be Donatist,
Right.
but practically speaking, that's how the world operates. That's
Yep.
how you really do operate. How else could you explain the numerous schisms and the stupid, silly groups? I mean, if you searched up all the uncanonical groups, your head will spin. There's like 20, 30 of them. I know a fake Orthodox website that's condemning like 12 different other
Yeah.
fake Orthodox groups.
I've seen it. Yeah.
And that's basically the world of fake Orthodoxy. And the other canonical violation is basically divorce with children, and then marry another person that's divorced with children. And one other fake Orthodox made note of this and said, not even in World Orthodoxy do you see this. And this happened in the Milan Synod. So this is like the main fake Orthodox group. So the point I'm trying to make here is that like the reason why I'm talking about character is they themselves are uncanonical, right? So if they want to accuse us of being heretical, or of making or hierarchs making uncanonical decisions, they're not too far away from that. So again, it's a world full of hypocrites. It's a world full of and as you mentioned, they don't know theology. One particular fake Orthodox, I covered a debate between a fake Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox. It lasted like 2 hours, and it's more popular than the debate itself, which to me it's not really surprising. Who wants to listen to these people anyway? But what was really interesting is that throughout the debate, I have not seen a single theological argument that the fake Orthodox made. Whereas the debate is supposed to be theological, but all they talked about is history.
History, right.
And yeah, and to their credit, I will give them some credit. Some of their arguments were pretty good, but in a general scheme, didn't make any sense. And they didn't talk about theology. How can you call yourself an apologetics guy if you're not going to talk about theology? Anyway, another red flag to avoid is people that preach a gospel that's contrary to orthodoxy. So basically, people that preach against creationism will be a great idea. People that preach evolution, people that preach that dogma changes, that ecumenical councils or dogmatic councils accepted by the church are actually not dogmatically binding. Formism, ecumenism, modernism, secularist Americanism, that sort of stuff. So people that preach that kind of stuff, those are just examples. But anything that preaches contrary to Orthodox dogma, Orthodox teaching, any people should be pretty much avoided. And I will say, like, one of the greatest American examples of someone who's really Orthodox will be Father Seraphim Rose. And my priest himself, he's Russian. He doesn't know English. He has never been to the U.S. He loves Father Seraphim Rose. And a lot of Russian churches, a lot of Russian priests love Father Seraphim Rose. And for a good reason. It's because a lot of the ideas that he's talking about, a lot of the things that Father Rose is talking about is dogmatic. It's really Orthodox. And like a good litmus test is basically, and we're not like a Father Seraphim Rose cultists here. We appreciate him and we pretty much support his work, Genesis, Creation, Early Man, and all that stuff. But the reason why I'm talking about is that because he represents Orthodox thoughts in the United States, anyone that's against him, not every single person, but a lot of the people that are against him, it's kind of a red flag to
Well, yeah, exactly. Like,
observe,
because most
yeah.
of the time, the people who are against the things that we talk about or what Father Seraphim Rose talks about, they're the people who believe in theistic evolution. They believe the Bible has errors. They believe in all different forms of ecumenism. They believe in not converting people out of atheism and Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, which are heresies. They believe that some form of Marcionism, usually the Bible has errors. The Old Testament God's a different mean God. Or perhaps we love Origen, let's rehabilitate Origen. You will see that gaggle, that glob of errors usually go together in some. Now, some individuals might not have every one of those. They might have 5 of those. They might have 2 of those. But the tendency will be that the people who believe those things usually go together, and they usually hate all the people that we talk about. There was just this week one of the archons of the EP saying that John Maximovich was a schismatic. Literally this dumb, like he doesn't know what ROCOR is, and he thinks ROCOR is a schism. Literally one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, and he's one of Bartholomew's right-hand guys. Well, that's absurd, and again, what you tend to see is that kind of stuff going together in people of that mindset. And those people, they never They almost never believe or like the stuff that we talk about. Why? Well, it has nothing to do with actually proving the theology. They just use a bunch of ad hominems. They'll say that we're mean. They'll say that we think we're better than everybody. We'll say that we are rigid and we're dogmatic and we debate people. Oh, you mean like what all the church fathers did? Yeah, I will gladly take on those acronym or those accusations, because if you read the Gospels, that's what Jesus does, right? Jesus goes around and debates the Pharisees constantly, and he debates the Sadducees, and he debates people, and he proves things from the Old Testament. If you read Paul, Paul throughout Acts goes and debates and does that, right? And he's not sorry for doing that. He's not supposed to feel bad for doing that. And when you say that to these people, they say, "Oh, well, you're just being a Protestant." No, doing what Jesus and Paul did is not Protestant. If you think that's Protestant, then you have no idea what religion you're in. You have no idea what you're talking about. So a lot of these people, again, they're actually fake Orthodox, even though they might be in the Episcopal structure of canonical Orthodoxy. If you believe a bunch of wrong things, you can go to church all day. It doesn't matter. If you're actually wrong, and if you actually believe heretical things, and these things are heretical, by the way, and there are specific, you could say, errors to specific places and times and regions. In America, it's very popular. I would say one of the big mistakes that American Orthodox make is what we call Ameridoxy. What is that? Well, that's when you put the ideas of American Enlightenment revolutionary philosophy equal to or above divine revelation and Orthodox tradition. Even, quote, liberal Orthodox people have noticed this. Father Schmemann noticed this. He says that people in American Orthodox churches actually put Americanism above the theology of the church. And so they'll say things like, well, we got to spread democracy, we got to spread free markets, and we got to have Republican democratic government in all these other countries because that's America. And by the way, that way when we have all this freedom in these other countries, we can have orthodoxy there. Totally wrong-headed. Totally wrong-headed. As if, and this is the key, what's the key error here? The key error, the key mistake is that there's no tradition or history of an Orthodox doctrine of the civil state. I had a 3-hour debate, 2.5-hour debate one time with a prominent normative Orthodox priest in America who told me that the state itself is a satanic institution. And I'm like, are you a Baptist? Did you get this from Roger Williams? What are you talking about? That's totally contrary to the doctrine of Symphonia, totally contrary to thousands of years of Orthodox emperors, kings, and rulers that are sainted. We have coronation ceremonies. What are you talking about? And it's because he's preaching Americanism. Right? Americanism, the ideas of the Enlightenment, are first and foremost. That's his basic presupposition. And then on top of that, perhaps behind it, we can bring along this train of some of these Orthodox ideas, as long as they don't contradict the Constitution, right? Total nonsense.
And what you just talked about, that sounds very close to the heresy of Tolstoy, who believed in Christian anarchism, except Tolstoy is actually logically consistent. And because he believes in anarchism, no state, he also naturally believes that there should be no church, right? If there's no state, then why should there be a church, right? The church is, to him, operates kind of like a state. And he will be actually kind of correct to say that the church, in a way, does indeed operate like a state, not completely, but there are similarities, there are iconographic similarities there. But to complete the red flags, to avoid this is going to be important to clarify as well. People that are influenced by heterodox sources and equating it with the gospel. So for example, I just recently, just in this discussion, I referred to Evagrius Ponticus, who's a condemned heretic. Now, does Evagrius Ponticus, who, by the way, comes from the same region as I do, represent. But does Evagrius Pontus, does he have insights? Of course he does have insights, but do we consider his whole system as equal to Orthodox dogma and thought? Of course we don't, and that's why he's condemned, right? In spite of his, and he's very influential when it comes to Orthodox spirituality. But again, just like people like Tertullian and even people like Origen, who had a lot of positive influence on Orthodoxy, you could say, still end up, their whole system eventually, in one way or the other, is completely corrupt and should not be accepted and is completely condemned. And one of the interesting things in Orthodoxy, you have the Synodicon of Orthodoxy from the 9th century, I believe, which condemns Hellenic philosophers. And that might prompt someone to ask, well, don't you use Hellenic philosophical terms? Well, it's kind of the response that I will give is that, like, yeah, they have insights. Obviously, they have insights. Even Satanists sometimes can come up with insights. A broken clock is right twice a day. But that doesn't mean that we accept their entire system.
Right.
And a lot of people that make that mistake, I mean, it's kind of like I used to make that mistake. So I'm not like trying to say that, oh, I'm better than you. But really, it's kind of like, it's a common sense mistake, but it's a simple mistake that people make. And the final red flag to avoid is hyper spiritualism, people that try to make their spirituality like a very public, right? They try to be basically people that put all their eggs in the hyper spiritual basket. Those people should be generally avoided because although they might have good insights when it comes to theology, they don't understand anything about theology. They don't care about theology.
And they love to hyper spiritual virtue signal, especially on Twitter, and social media. It's the tone policing concern commenter, right? Like, oh, bro, I understand that you feel strongly about this, but Saint so-and-so says don't ever debate, which is probably taken out of context, right? Like, so it's the guy who's always wanting to like come in with the spiritual one-up. Let me spiritually one-up you and show you how, even though I'm coming off as very humble, actually the motivations in my constant spiritual tweeting is to show everybody how humble and spiritual I am. Jesus says that is the sin of the Pharisees. They love to, brothers, let me pray before you and let me show you how humble I am. You see, like praying on the corner, right? It's just a spirit. It's a Twitter version of that, basically.
Oh, and on the opposite side of that is the hyper rigorous. The people that put the eggs on the other basket. People that like constantly try to argue and antagonize people. People that just try to look for fights on Twitter to fulfill their bloodlust, their blood sports bloodlust. Those people. That's also a huge red flag to avoid. And both are basically, as I mentioned before, it's very important to keep spirituality and intellectual theology in balance, right? These two are very important for an Orthodox Christian. And so that will finalize pretty much all of it. And we can character assassinate people now. We can talk about the people, specific people that we should be avoiding.
Let's talk about Origen. So the first one that we want to stress in this, because this is always coming up, and all of these Fordham people, John Baer and other people like this, they're now wanting to rehabilitate and promote Origen and Origenism. So again, one of the key things about Orthodoxy that is great is that it doesn't require you having to go and literally read every heretic to know that he's wrong, right? One of the key things, the reasons that we have ecumenical councils is that we can know when we're in the world of Orthodoxy that it's correct because it's the church and it's Christ's church, and you have kind of this intuitive inner sense when you become Orthodox and you're participating in it, living it, that you know that it's correct. And so you don't have to go and, do I have to read 90 works from Origen to find out if Origen was actually right all along and the whole church got it wrong? No, we don't have to do that. Now, I'm not saying that if you want to learn about something that, you can just get it by osmosis, but I'm just saying that it's practical. It's practical in the sense that I can know that if the church condemned Origenism in multiple councils and multiple great church fathers from our church who are sainted and so forth, I don't have to go back and rehabilitate and reinvent the wheel. We have ecumenical councils. We don't have to go back and rehabilitate Arius or Nestorius.
And as Saint Maximus says, the followers of Origen are not going to be going on a good place. He actually says Origen's followers are going to hell with him.
Yeah, in fact, I brought that up to a friend of mine who is trying to now defend Origenism after being Orthodox for many years. And so the first thing I want to say, one of the easiest ways to dispel this is that people will say, well, Origen was wrongly condemned at the Fifth Council. All right, let's set aside the Fifth Council, and we're not going to talk about apologetics and universalism just for this moment. There's another document, okay, the Confession of Saint Sophronius, and it's part of the Sixth Ecumenical Council. So this is the council after the Fifth Council. And there's an extensive 4-page condemnation of Origen for multiple mistakes. Okay, so we're not just talking about did he teach universal restoration of all creatures. There's multiple errors and mistakes that Origen makes. You could probably list about 30 of them here that are so significant that they have an entire council after the fifth council, an even bigger council, the sixth council, completely condemning Origen. Not only that, for his doctrine of creation, for his doctrine of successive falls, for his doctrine of pre-existent souls, for his doctrine of dialectics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As David mentioned, Origenism is specifically condemned on 3 or 4 different points in the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, which is the seventh council. You're right there. But also St. Maximus himself, which is very ironic because people say, oh, but there's an influence of Origen on these different fathers. Yes, but he's corrected down the road. So you can't just go to the fact that, oh, well, Gregory of Nyssa liked to read Origen, so therefore we can rehabilitate Origen. You're missing the centuries of dialogue and confusion that Origen caused in the church that had to be sussed out and purged, again, over many centuries. So again, the Sixth Council is very explicit. It's not just about Apologetics and universalism. The Sixth Council is extensive in its condemnation for 4 pages of his mistakes, and he's included in that council's heresiology. When we come to the writings of St. Maximus in the Ambigua, Maximus has these 2 volumes of the Ambigua. Multiple Ambigua are dedicated to refuting the errors of Origenism. Okay? And as you said, he points out that Origen is not going to a good place. Okay? So
neither are his followers, by the way.
And so what happens is that when we try to rehabilitate Origen, and this is what I got my friend to admit, who is unfortunately going in this route a couple days ago, I said, well, doesn't this ultimately mean that 3 councils of the church are also wrong, and that also St. Maximus is now significantly wrong? And he said, yes, Maximus was responding to things that Origen didn't teach, to forgeries. Now, I don't know how he thinks he knows that these are all forgeries. I'm like, don't you think that they had a better knowledge of Origenism back then? They had access to documents closer to the time of Origen. And you're relying on people like Bart Ehrman and these people who are trying to, through Fordham funding, promote Origenism. Well, yeah, okay, fine. I'm willing to bite the bullet now. And he says now he admits that the church in the ecumenical councils made errors. So that's where this leads us to, right? To be consistent when we go down these stupid routes, when we don't just trust the church and the wisdom of the church, we fall into prelest, we fall into pride, and even to the point of now, oh, well, St. Maximus, totally got Origenism wrong. He didn't get it right. And we see where this leads us, right? And you're just a few steps away from, well, you might as well just be a perennialist at this point, right? So that's why we have to stick to the rule and the guide of the church. And you can't be wiser than the church.
And speaking of Origenism and Origen himself, I think we should head down and talk about the people who try to become Origen but are the less intelligent versions of it. And I think the best person to start off this people to avoid list will definitely be David Bentley Hart, because
yeah.
not only with, I mean, Origenism is basically the main foundation of this, but just in general, like, it's not just theology. That's also very important to emphasize. This guy is the same person who said Julian the Apostate is the best emperor, who called Saint Justinian a stupid brute, and all this kind of stupid stuff. And he also said Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who he's fanboying over, is the great politician, and he even wrote a piece on New York Times to defend her. Again, I don't have to mention that she defends abortion. So David Bentley Hart, as someone that's representing Orthodoxy, is supporting an abortionist politician. How does that look for Orthodoxy when someone does that? And so in every single way, we will say David Bentley Hart is definitely someone to avoid. And we can even talk about like the universalism. If you talk about the book that he has, now I don't recommend him, but there's a certain Orthodox person that wrote a review about his book, and I checked the review out, and it's incredibly funny. The whole book, David Bentley Hart is talking about how intelligent he is, and he's just pridefully just saying, "Oh, I believe in universalism because I'm smart. People that don't believe in my universalism are stupid people." He literally says these things, and he doesn't even quote church fathers.
You're a fundamentalist. Like, come on, dude. Seriously, fundamentalism. So basically, everybody who hasn't believed this tiny view is a fundamentalist. That's ridiculous.
Exactly, and
Yes, David
he's
Bentley Hart,
playing.
by the way, yes, David Bentley Hart, as people are noting in the chat, is very close to the Fordhamite people. That's because the CIA is putting money into these people. They're putting money into not just Fordham, but also Origenism. And why do you think they would promote Origenism? Well, because it's a great means to transition people into ecumenism and perennialism, and ultimately Roman Catholicism. They're very useful because Roman Catholicism is based around perennialism. Natural theology, Hellenism is perennialism. And so Origen is a great tool, a great guide to funnel people into these things. That's why there's so much money put into these people. And everybody knows this now. It's public on multiple websites. Multiple journalistic outlets have shown and demonstrated now, Ortho-Christian, many others, that all of this money, foundation money, goes into these things. And guess what? Origenism is part of that. How many times have I done talks on the CIA studying groups, ethnographies, right, to know what to promote to people, to take people in a certain direction? Now, does that mean David Bentley Hart's a CIA agent? No, I'm not saying that. He doesn't even probably know about how geopolitics works. But what I'm saying is that people who are put into university positions are put into those positions because they will toe a certain line. And we know that for certain. I can demonstrate that from David Wimhoff's book, from the history of the Rockefellers, their own biographies. They all talk about controlling seminaries, controlling education, controlling the arts through who gets what chair in what department and who trains who. And the people who come up underneath these people, they just rehash the stuff that their great professors told them.
And someone might ask, like, well, how does the CIA, why will the CIA care about Origen? I mean, look at the Roman Catholic Church. They pretty much sainted Origen at this stage. They refer to him as a church father, and any Roman Catholic you talk to is, even the trads, they love Origen. And so this happened, like this sort of, how should I say, this sort of subversion in the Roman Catholic Church happened ways before. And so it's only natural that other intelligence agencies will use bad characters in Orthodox history to push them into the forefront. So it's not as silly as it initially sounds. It's actually pretty plausible because it already happened beforehand. And speaking of foundations giving money to news outlets, Orthodox Times is one of those. The U.S. government, Orthodox Times themselves admit this. They literally got $100,000 from the U.S. government. What's the purpose? To combat misinformation. Oh yeah, Orthodox Times is there to combat misinformation for the U.S. government. Surely now we can trust Orthodox Times to give us reliable news coverage on especially topics such as Ukraine, which the United States has no geopolitical interest. Guys, don't look at that direction. That doesn't happen at all. And yeah, so like I didn't know much about Orthodox Times, but the moment I saw that they got foundation money, it's instantly dropped. Like should be instantly avoided. Those websites that they get foundation money from the U.S. government, they should be instantly avoided. It's really obvious that they are going to propped up to become propaganda tools of the U.S. government. And that doesn't mean that, you know, some people say, oh, isn't Ortho-Christian Russian biased? Sure, you could say that. But what differentiates Ortho-Christian from a lot of these websites is that outside of the news coverage, for example, they still have a lot of really good quality content outside of the news coverage. They have a lot of really good. One of those articles is the Old Calendars Ecclesiology being critiqued by Peter on Twitter.
Well, they have a bunch of my articles there, so yeah.
Yeah, and you know, there are legitimately really good Orthodox articles. So that's kind of separates Ortho-Christian, at least. Even you can argue, yeah, I won't deny that Ortho-Christian is biased. All news outlets are going to be biased by nature, but they still have really good Orthodox content that you could check out. Compared to Orthodox Times, which at this stage really has become a U.S. government tool, unfortunately, but it really has become that way. And speaking of Fordham, I think, yeah, I mean, we should give a shout out to the Fordham crowd for spreading homosexuality. Every single Orthodox Christian is very excited about homosexuality. George Demakopoulos, big shout outs to you, or Aristotle Papanikolaou, and them trying to subvert Orthodox Christianity and church history. And one of their methods, let me give you an example of what they did. So in order to respond to the supposed traditional Orthodox Christians, one of the arguments they made on Twitter is that no church father uses the word traditional to explain orthodoxy. Well, that kind of seems common sense to me, buddy, because why will you use the word traditional to explain Orthodox even it's already traditional inherently by design? You don't have to use a certain word to describe it in a certain way. You can use different words,
Well,
right?
actually, Athanasius, there's times where Athanasius says that I appeal to the tradition of the true fathers. He would say things like the Council of Nicaea was guided by the Holy Spirit. So if Athanasius has no problem
Exactly.
saying that stuff, we shouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. So like even if they never use the word tradition, who cares? The fact that they're appealing to
That's just
past
sophistry.
councils,
Yeah,
past
that's
church
just
fathers.
sophistry.
Exactly. It's just subversion. So it's just outlining the subversion that these Fordham crowd people does. Anyone that's associated with Fordham, just stay away from them. They're demoniacs. Stay away from these people. And many of these people will be again George Demakopoulos, Ursula Papanikolaou, who by the way have very they also produced and endorsed very blasphemous quote unquote art that basically spits in the face of iconography. I don't even want
Yeah,
to
a
talk
lot of these
about it
people
that
are.
much, but
Yeah, these people are. They're not even Orthodox. They're just saying that they are. Some of them are probably Satanists secretly, quite
one
literally.
example they did, for example, is that they basically there's a piece called "Ruler of the Cosmos"
Yeah,
where Patriarch Bartholomew is basically like the king of the universe. I mean, what are we trying to spread here? Are we trying to
that's
spread Roman
propaganda.
Catholicism here?
Yeah,
Like, what's
right.
going on?
Yeah, exactly.
And the other people you mentioned, John Bear, I will say avoid. Callistus Ver is also part of the Fordham crowd. He has appeared with the Fordham people, and unfortunately, he
Sister
has to be
Vasa should
avoided
be
as well.
avoided as well. Yeah.
hmm And another person, another clergy that we unfortunately had to avoid will be Stephen Freeman. And Jay, you yourself have argued about what Stephen Freeman talked about, so I pretty much
Yeah,
let you do the
there's a
talking here.
Marcionite tendency in Father Freeman, which I did 2 videos critiquing his philosophy, his approach to the Bible, which is completely not patristic, completely wrong to say that the Bible has multiple errors, and to deny the historicity of the text of the Old Testament is completely nonsensical. It's in fact the Origenist error. In fact, so by the way, Emil asked a good question that I did want to address. Because people will say, well, I've got the Philip Schaff set of the Church Fathers here, and this is the Ecumenical Council's volume, and then they'll look at it. I'm not faulting you, Emil, because I had the same issue. And the only thing that you'll find about Origen specifically in a council is the Justinian's acts in relationship to the Fifth Council, where you have the condemnation of Origen. And then at Nicaea 2, Origen is mentioned again. Also, I'll point out that if you read... this is on page 549. Origen is recondemned at the Seventh Council, but the best, most extensive condemnation of Origen is not in the Schaff set. Unfortunately, it's in this printed version from Oxford, which is the Confession of Saint Sophronius, who was very close to Saint Maximus. And it's a synodical letter that he wrote and passed around to the other bishops and patriarchates, and they signed on to it. And so this is part of the Sixth Council. It's part of the documentation of the Sixth Council. And so it has a list of heresies that the rest of the fathers all signed on to. It condemns Marcionism. It condemns the view that the Old Testament is not historical, by the way. On page 125, you're a heretic if you don't believe that Moses and the prophets are relating history. And Origenism is condemned, as we said, for denying the doctrine of creation, for denying Eden, for denying Adam and Eve as real people, for reintroducing Greek paganism, Greek myths, Greek mythology, Platonism, Neoplatonism, preexistence of souls, eternal recurring falls in the eschaton, the denial of the bodily resurrection. All of these things and more are condemned explicitly in 4 pages. And again, not only that, this even condemns the doctrine of allegorizing Eden to not be the creation of an actual human being and 6-day creation. So if you teach theistic evolution, you're actually falling under the condemnation of Saint Sophronius here and the Sixth Council. And as you mentioned, Emil, about it's the Trollo canons that affirm, and by the way, Trollo is affirmed at Nicaea 2, that you cannot believe in death as natural. This is canon, it's on page 496, and it's canon 109. Whoever asserts that Adam was created mortal and that whether he had sinned or not, he would have died in the body, that is that death is natural, is condemned. So that's actually that's the African code, which is part of Trollo, which is then accepted at Nicaea II. So those are the easy ways to just refute Origenism. Just to point out that Father Staniloy in Volume 1 has multiple chapters refuting Origenism. St. Maximus has multiple sections of the Ambigua refuting Origenism. So to turn around and try to rehabilitate this guy, you can obviously see that the totality of Orthodoxy unravels. You've got multiple centuries, multiple infallible councils where the church would be wrong. Oh, oops, we got this all wrong. We didn't correctly understand Origen, and we misattributed these things to him. And oh, actually, he's a good guy. Well, now wait a minute. What's the next step? Oh, well, I guess Nestorius was a good guy too. Oh, Arius was a good guy. Marcion was a good guy. All the heretics are now. You see, it's a Pandora's box, and the whole thing unravels.
Yeah, and another universalist will also be Aidan Kimmel, and I think this will be a good time to talk about why universalism is also bad. And aside from like council condemnations, like let's say there's an Anglican watching or a Roman Catholic or whatever, Protestant watching and saying, well, okay, they're talking about councils and stuff, but like, why is it theologically wrong? And I think that will be a good idea to also cover, because a lot of these people are, universalists, and like why they believe in universalism. And I can, if you want, I can kind of give a briefer and you can go on detailed, because I kind of made a video about responding to DBH's David Bentley Hart's universalism, and talked about St. Maximus's universalism, which is actually very different in very key areas. So for example, St. Maximus himself will preach. So there is indeed an Orthodox universalism in the Second Coming, the recapitulation. But a lot of what the mistake that David Bentley Hart makes, and this is very connected to his understanding of free will, is the mistake that he makes is because all nature is going to be restored and all that stuff, that means everyone is going to be basically in heaven, right? But the issue with that is that mistake comes from a theological misconception, because the personal mode of willing that you use in your life is also going to be restored. And because of that, if you have lived your life in bad will, you use your will in a bad way, basically, in your mode of willing in a bad manner, the experience you're going to have, right? This is subjective, right? This is going to be subjective to each person's experience. But the experience of a Christian, a person that lived a Christian life, is going to be basically good, right? He's going to enjoy the divine light of God, the participation that he has with God. The participation that a sinner has, someone that rejects God, someone that hates God, is obviously not going to have a fun time. For him, the divine light of God is going to burn him. And so for St. Maximus, this is a subjective experience. So yes, there is indeed a restoration of all nature, and there is indeed a universalism. That is correct. But the logic of universalism is because of the mode of willing that each person employs in their lives, it's still going to be retained in the Second Coming, in the recapitulation, and because of that, the experience is going to be subjective. And this is completely in line with what a lot of the Orthodox spiritual fathers say. You will not find this in Roman Catholic theology. This is completely lost in Western theology. But this is very key, I will say very key in our theology, because there's an aspect of how a person lives his life and how he sees God, right? God ultimately did give us a free will and we do have the option, basically, to use that will in a very bad manner, to the point where we completely reject God and reject him, to the point where even when he appears to us directly, we don't experience goodness. We actually experience very bad things because we hate God. And if you look at people, certain people, Satanists and whatever, you look at these people and you'll be like, well, if God appeared to these people, I mean, they won't be happy. They will hate it, right? And ultimately, it's not because they are bad by nature. This is also some mistake that a lot of people. Human beings are not bad or evil by nature. It's the way they employ their will. It's the way they move their will away from the good is what makes them bad, basically. And if you have any
Yeah,
thing
so
to say.
keep in
or
mind
any-
too, Fordham University is a Jesuit university. It is the school that John Brennan attended. He is the alumni. It's a famous Jesuit school. It's a famous CIA school. I absolutely know what I'm talking about. It's very easy to verify that Fordham is a CIA university. So once again, this stuff is not happenstance, and I'm not conspiracy theorizing. I'm telling you exactly how the CIA and these different entities work in the university sphere. And they will recruit people not just on the basis of doing, I mean, it's not James Bond bullshit. The way the CIA works is that they're interested in culture creation. They're interested in controlling and steering. The entirety of culture and education is part of that. I've documented that, by the way, in my books. What David is saying is not just St. Maximus. This is also in Father Rose. If you read the last 2 pages, pages 98 and 99 of his book on nihilism, Father Seraphim Rose says exactly what David just said about your own will. The way that you use and hypostatize your will is what will determine your experience of the afterlife in terms of ever ill-being or ever well-being. So what they do is they use the fact that Maximus and many of the church fathers talk about the universal restoration of human nature, and then they'll say, you see, so everybody's saved. No. That's not the totality of it. The fact that everybody's resurrected does not mean that everybody's going to have a positive experience of the afterlife, because the way that you used your will determine that experience of the afterlife. So now, is it true that some fathers speculated, St. Gregory Nyssa, did he speculate about the possibility of a restoration of all beings afterwards? Yes, he did, and he was influenced by Origen. But we don't follow one church father, and they all know that. All these Fordham people know that. They know that Orthodox theology is not determined by just picking a guy that you like. If that was so, we'd be Roman Catholics. We'd all just follow Augustine. But that's not how it works. So you can't pick a dude in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century and say, I follow that guy. And then to the exclusion of later councils with hundreds of bishops and fathers and saints, purifying and picking out the errors in an earlier guy. Obviously, right? Again, that's what this does. This is part of the 6th council. So you have to end up denying the ecumenical councils, and many of those people are openly, they don't have a problem with that. They're, I don't believe the ecumenical councils are infallible, and yet they claim to still be Orthodox. Now, I want to stress too that, remember, these people, David Bentley Hart, John Dyer, these are people who will say that, there's plenty of church fathers who actually don't teach the essence energy distinction. Actually, Dyer has a lecture where he says that St. Irenaeus teaches absolute divine simplicity. Oh, and by the way, it's time to go back to the Roman Catholics. These are snakes. These are people who are lying and are there to take you back to Roman Catholicism. What does David Bentley Hart say? He loves John Paul. He loves all those Vatican II people, and it's time to reunite with Roman Catholicism. They're ecumenists. It's not an accident that they're ecumenists. Now, consider this. These Fordham people exist in part, not just to promote some of this Origen crap, but also to reconcile everybody to Roman Catholicism. It just happens to be a Jesuit university. I wonder what's going on there. And what do they say? They say that St. Gregory Palamas taught the same thing as Aquinas. That's what these Fordham people say. Do you think these Fordham people ever talk about this? No, they do not. They don't ever talk about the debate between St. Gregory Palamas and the Barlaamite, because this is a complete condemnation of everything that the Roman Catholics say from St. Gregory Palamas in terms of divine simplicity. So here you have an entire book where St. Gregory Palamas says that Roman Catholicism is heretical. Uncut Mountain Press, by the way, is putting out the writings of St. Gregory Palamas on the Filioque, calling it heretical. And those things are being suppressed because these people are ecumenists and they want to unite with Rome. And they don't want to be honest, and they don't want to tell you St. Gregory Palamas did not teach Thomistic doctrines. He condemns every one of them in this thing. That's why I keep covering it. And they don't ever talk about it. They probably haven't even read it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know about some of these guys, but they're not going to be honest. I mean, again, here's a whole work that makes it absolutely impossible to blend Orthodox theology with Roman Catholicism. They all know Mark of Ephesus says that we can't unite with Roman Catholicism. Who are the pillars of Orthodoxy, right? Palamas, Mark of Ephesus. You can't blend Roman Catholicism with that. Look at Roman Catholicism. Who in their right mind would want to go back to that? Pachamama? That's what you want? And it just so happens that all the people that are trying to take you back to Pachamama, what do they believe? They happen to believe in theistic evolution. They believe the Bible has errors. They believe in Origenism. They believe all this garbage. It's not accidental. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one, and I'm gonna move on with the original topic. But one thing I want to remark is that I find it really stupid that people think that all of this is really like, oh, conspiracy theory stuff. And look, universities are very influential in academic thought. Why
I
would you
mean,
not use that to your
who is so
advantage if you're
dumb? Who is so
CIA?
retarded to not know that the CIA is on campuses? If you don't know that, you're an idiot.
Even logically speaking, I mean, purely theoretical, it completely makes sense. I mean, to deny that is just being very silly, and you're assuming that the state, the government, the CIA is just a bunch of 70 IQ idiots. They're not 70 IQ idiots. Anyways, another group of people that are most likely also influenced a lot by the intelligence agencies is Orthodox in dialogue. Stay away from these people. This is basically the internet extension of Fordham. Just a bunch of LGBT apologists, and that's basically what the website is all about, LGBT apologists. And it's not that, like, here's the thing, and a lot of, I know what these people are going to say, oh, you hate gay people. We obviously want the best for them. That's why we are denouncing LGBT in the first place, because we want the best for them. And it's putting rhetoric aside. Obviously, we want them to become Orthodox, and we want them to leave their sinful past, however long that takes. But we want that intention to be there. And all this stuff is just hurting LGBT people themselves. I will say that, like, Orthodox in dialogue, they're just hurting these people. And by spreading that sort of apologetical thought in Orthodoxy, they're just hurting the faith, they're hurting the people that they're supposed to be saving. And in general, just avoid these people. Again, these are just a bunch of Fordham people, Fordham extension. This might be very surprising, but I have to say it. And I even plan to make a video about this, because they really need to be, people really need to know about these people. Reddit. Stay away from Reddit, particularly the Orthodox Christianity subreddit. The first thing I would like to say is that the name Jay Dyer, yes, Jay's name is blacklisted. You didn't hear me wrong. You heard me completely correctly. They blacklisted Jay Dyer's name, and one of the persons, an acquaintance, asked why did they blacklist Jay's name. It's
Well,
basically a bunch of non-answers.
Yeah, it's just
but
it's stuff
accused,
made up. That's not even true. Stuff that I like. Absolutely no basis for it.
yeah, and like, yeah, he's associated with the white supremacists.
let's not mention that. But that I'm a part of some sort of far right group, which is made up. I have no association with that far right group. But again, I want to stress that, like, this book here, which is illustrating everything that David's talking about, if you're a trad Catholic, or if you're a curious Orthodox person, or you don't really get geopolitics, or if you want to understand what's going on here, this is a guy who's not a conspiracy theorist. He's a lawyer. David Wimhoff is a traditional Catholic lawyer. And the reason his book is relevant to you as Orthodox or anybody else in this field is because he spent many, many years detailing what happened to the Roman Catholic Church in terms of how it was subverted, not by the KGB, but by the CIA, to become an institution that would promote Americanism. And so what he does is he goes into NGOs, he goes into foundations, he goes into think tanks, he goes into the very wealthy families, Rockefellers, etc., who put tremendous amounts of money and power and manpower, attention, research, etc., into how to take these institutions and turn them to the usage of the deep state, the CIA, State Department, Rockefeller Foundation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he details this. Again, it's not a conspiracy book. It's a lawyer detailing this in, I think he's got, how many footnotes? He's got in this book something like, it's like 800 pages, 1,000 footnotes from scholarly sources by a lawyer. Okay, this guy's not a crazy wacko tinfoil guy. He's a lawyer telling you the history of John Courtney Murray, the famous Jesuit, and his associations, and how these powerful institutions, Skull and Bones, CIA, Time Life magazine, how they utilized and worked with John Courtney Murray and other people to get Vatican II to accept Americanism, religious liberty, right? Dignitatis Humanae, all these different documents that relate to the promotion of Americanism. especially at Vatican II, and then how the Vatican would become an instrument to promote that stuff globally. And that's part of the key reason that you see a big difference between the pre-Vatican II church and the post-Vatican II church, right? A lot of trads, they know all about the theology issues, but they don't know the geopolitical issues. And this is a key puzzle piece that David Wim Hof has given us. It's one of the most important books I've ever read. I highly recommend that you read this, especially if you're Orthodox and you want to understand what's happening in American Orthodoxy, because even though this is about Roman Catholic Church, it's the exact same people, the exact same money, the exact same foundations, the exact same power structure that's doing the exact same thing in the Orthodox world as happened to the Roman Catholic world. It's indispensable to understanding this stuff. And so really, once you grasp that, when you see that, you've got the whole thing figured out. Now you see the whole picture. And you're not going to be distracted by Origenism and, David Bentley Hart and all this nonsense, because that's just a small part in this bigger puzzle piece, this bigger play that's being put out that Wim Hof explains extensively.
And an example of this is just an example of the sort of stuff that you see on Reddit, Orthodox Christianity, is that you have a thread on yoga, and then someone asks, "Oh, why can I not do yoga? I want to do yoga." And do you see people in the comments saying you should not do it because it's a spiritual practice, you should avoid it? No, you have just a bunch of people saying, "Oh yeah, you go for it, you should do yoga," even though you have numerous different people, fathers, that denounce yoga. Father Seraphim Rose will be an example, but even just general Russian fathers or
Right.
Serbian fathers that tackle this, denounce yoga.
Yeah,
so
it's a religious
this is just one of
practice
the
about
examples.
calling up deities into you. It's crazy.
Exactly, and so that's just one of the many examples of the craziness you'll see on Reddit. Another person to avoid and is Romanides. I know Jay talked about Romanides a lot, and apparently a lot of people did get influenced by Romanides. My impression of Romanides is that I read certain articles about from a lot of people. One of those articles was from an ex-Coptic, now Orthodox Christian person, and one of the first references he read was Romanides, John Romanides, and he taught initially, and when he read Romanides was completely attacking Pope Saint Leo and saying that Pope Saint Leo was bad and the Monophysites were not as bad as they seemed and all that kind of stuff. And he thought initially that that's the Orthodox position because of Romanides, but then he realized, oh, it's not him being unbiased. It's that it's his completely anti Western view on everything that influences us. So Romanides does have a very hardcore anti-West slant that goes way too far. And one other issue is that outside of the anti-West slant, he's otherwise very ecumenistic. He's very ecumenistic towards the Oriental Orthodox, for example. He's very ecumenistic towards other groups, as long as they're not Western. Okay, if you're not Western, I'm your friend. If you're Western, I hate you. That's kind of like the impression I got from Romanides, but I'm sure that you know a lot more about the stuff that he talks about. But that's kind of like the stuff that I've seen from Romanides.
The chief problems in Father Romanides, would be that he doesn't believe that there's any positive punitive aspect to God's justice, which is completely contrary to countless church fathers' statements about God having an actual energy of divine justice, which is positive. The Bible in many places divine revelation in many places speaks of the curse, and that the curse is something that God actually does enact. We have many, if you read the canons that are, again, canons of the African Code that are part of Trollo that are accepted at Nicaea II, Canon 110, Canon 110 speaks of infants being baptized for the remission of sin, and then Canon 111 and 112 speaks of in pretty similar terms to the Councils of Orange when it comes to grace. And of course Father Romanides would I know it's more nuanced than talking about semi-Pelagianism. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about whether there is an actual curse and whether sins are remitted in baptism in any sense whatsoever. And I think that those canons are very difficult for Romanides to make sense of. I think he would have to do a lot of reinterpreting words and meanings. So his critiques go too far. You're absolutely right. And the other critique, he believes that Genesis is a bunch of Babylonian creation myths, which is false. That's completely incorrect and a denial of revelation. And ironically, he believes very strongly and is always talking about how you can't know anything about divine revelation without your nous being enlightened and seeing God directly. And then when he explains the doctrine of Genesis, he says that we know Genesis is Babylonian myths because unbelieving textual higher critics have shown this, which makes absolutely no sense. So he's trusting unbelieving higher critics, but at the same time he turns around and says that nobody actually knows anything about God unless they've had a direct experience of the divine light, which is 10 people maybe ever. So it's total nonsense. It's total double think. He's got weird views about how you could scientifically test there's a spinning spiral that goes around the relics of the saints that you could scientifically experiment and show. Just very bizarre stuff where on the one hand he's talking about the importance of science and how you can demonstrate that relics have spinning vortexes around them, and then he turns around and says that divine revelation in scripture is full of error and that nobody actually knows what's in divine revelation. Just all kinds of bizarre statements from Father Romanides. I just think he's kind of a quack. He believed that aliens were real, that there was going to be a possible alien invasion. There's no reason not to believe in aliens. And yes, he does believe that. I'm not making that up. So it's just all this weird, bizarre stuff that he thought was somehow worth talking about, which is just nonsense. And he also believed that there's absolutely no analogia at all. In fact, not just to the essence of God, but also to the energies. That's contrary to countless statements in the Church Fathers, contrary to countless Orthodox theologians, Father Staniele, St. Gregory Nyssa. I mean, all the way through, the Logi doctrine is based on an analogia between the energies and the created order. And he says there's absolutely no analogia at all, not just between the essence of God and creatures, but between the energies and creatures, which would mean ultimately that you can't talk about God. And in some places he actually says, he says all idolatry is believing that there are words and creeds that tell you truths about God. What? I mean, just nonsense stuff. So I would say avoid Romanite, even though there's a couple books where he's really good and he comes really close to where I would almost recommend the book, but he then just undermines the whole thing with these other quack views that are just ridiculous. So I wouldn't waste my time. There's far better people to read, like Father Staniloy or Vladimir Losky or Father Florovsky, who again, they're not perfect. There's no theologians of the 20th century who are going to have everything perfectly correct, but they're better than those guys than Father Romanides.
Yeah, and I was going to actually mention this before, but I think this is still a good time, is that one thing that we have in Orthodoxy over other Christian religions, or even other religions, is that we don't have a single guy that we depend everything on, right? So for Roman Catholicism, you have Thomas Aquinas. For Oriental heterodoxy, well, you have Severus of Antioch. And for the Assyrian Church of the East, well, actually not even Nestorius, but I will say you have Diodore of Tarsus, right? He's kind of like the guy for these people, right? And so you have a bunch of individual people, and even like a small group maybe in these other heretical groups. Lutheranism and Protestantism in general has Martin Luther, for example. And in Orthodoxy, it's a lot more holistic, right? We don't depend on a single person for every single theological problem. Sure, we do have systematic theologians. You could say St. John of Damascus was one of them. But generally speaking, we have a wide array of people who have very correct views, right? They have very correct views, but we don't go to them and say, oh, his word is equal to gospel. Whereas even though in the Roman Catholic system, yes, I mean, Thomas Aquinas' word is not equal to the gospel. It is in praxis. It is.
Yeah, you want to avoid guruism, and sometimes that is a temptation. I mean, I've had friends that literally would just read everything through the lens of what Father Romanides said, and that's just preposterous. This is weird guruism. So all the church fathers, he said, got things wrong, but Romanides came to correct all that. It's just really bizarre stuff. That's a wrong attitude, right? You don't take any guy, and by the way, he's not even a saint. Like if you were going to pick some guru, you would at least think he would be a saint. Father Romanides isn't a saint; he's just a guy. So and it doesn't matter. I'm sure he's well respected amongst a lot of Greeks, but so what? I mean, on Father Romanides' own term, you should be listening to somebody who experienced the divine light directly, not him. So it doesn't even make any sense if you were going to pick a guru. But we don't pick gurus, right? So you have a spiritual father, but your spiritual father's not a guru. He can't tell you to do things against your conscience. He can't tell you to violate the law of God or something like that. That'd be crazy. And so in the same way, any individual person is an individual person, and they can be right, they can be wrong. We don't have this worship of authority as you see in the world of Roman Catholicism, where the word of Aquinas is the end of is supposed to shut down the debate or whatever. Now, I mean, I know Roman Catholics, strictly speaking, they don't technically believe that because they think Aquinas got things wrong, like Immaculate Conception and so forth, and they think he's just a doctor of the church. But still, we know that in that system, whether it's Augustine, Aquinas, or the Pope, it revolves around Catholicity being essentially one dude, which doesn't make any sense. That's why it's better to understand your theology from, say, the Sixth Council or from the canons. When you look at the canons and when you look at the Sixth Council or the decrees of the Seventh Council or whatever, or the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, you're getting a product of the mind of a whole generation of the church in terms of the whole ecumene. So that's a much better standard than, oh, well, that guy says X, Y, Z. Again, not discounting the writings of this or that saint or father. It's not to say that. But there is, in a sense, a kind of levels of authority, right? And what does St. Gregory of Nyssa say? He says, we don't follow the philosophers and the opinions of men. He says, divine revelation is what we consider our first and foremost authority. And that's correct.
Yeah, and like this is a kind of like something that Orthodoxy has over in that aspect is we have again, as I said before, we have a holistic view of the church and the church fathers. So for example, you have in the Oriental Orthodox case, we still have the same saints theoretically speaking, but when it comes to the Cappadocian fathers, suddenly they don't really care about what they say. Why? Well, because in a lot of regards, the Cappadocian fathers completely go against what they argue. The same with the Roman Catholics. They don't really care about the Cappadocian fathers. And so we're not afraid. Even St. Augustine, right? Someone who a lot of people say, oh, you hate St. Augustine because you disagree. Well, have you seen at least my content? A lot of the arguments I make against the fake Orthodox, against Sedevacantists, I refer to St. Augustine a lot of the times, right? Because St. Augustine, he's still a saint. He still has a lot of very valuable insights in spite of his mistakes. And so only within a holistic view can you have this kind of a system where every single church father has something incredibly valuable to say and something incredibly valuable to teach. And I think that will kind of what's going on?
No, the clip just started playing. Go ahead.
It's kind of like you remember the first stream when like my phone notification rang,
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. And I think that will pretty much be all about people to avoid. Like, do you have any other people in mind that we should remind to avoid, or should we move on to heresies to avoid, and like general heresies that people fall into and so on?
No, I think those are some of the major figures, and anybody else is probably just going to kind of be a derivative of them. I mean, some of the major outlets of Orthodox media that are out there are going to be promoting good stuff, and then they're also going to be promoting creepers and weirdos and weird stuff, as we've seen in the last year. I'm sure people can figure out who I'm talking about in terms of a big media organization out there. But so you just have to watch out. You have to be aware, and those are the key people to avoid, I would think of that come to mind. But let's talk about the errors themselves next.
Yeah, so we already tackled universalism. Modernism will be a good one to tackle. A lot of people, they might be wondering, what exactly is modernism? And I think we can both talk about what exactly is the heresy of modernism in Orthodoxy. Right off the bat, for me, it will be one of those things will be denial of social theory in Orthodoxy, meaning that basically separation of church and state. If you believe in a separation of church and state completely, where they're not in symphony, they're supposed to be away from each other, that will be an example of the modernist heresy, right? Another example will be disregarding ecumenical councils and dogmatic theology, basically saying, oh, those ecumenical councils, they erred, right? In some aspects, they erred, or they're open to error. That will be another aspect of modernism. As you mentioned before, spread Americanism is very deeply connected to
Right.
the modernist heresy, and I think that will pretty much be
Well, actually,
accurate to describe. And
ironically, I would say if you want to understand modernism, you might be surprised here. I would actually say go read a pope. Yes, a modern pope. Because Pius X, even though we're not traditional Catholics, Pius X has a famous encyclical where at the turn of the century he noticed the influence and power and spread of modernism, and this document is called Pacendi Dominici Gracious. It's a famous encyclical that he wrote that is condemning modernism. Significant parts of this encyclical make it into Denzinger, and so it is part of Roman Catholic Universal Ordinary Magisterial teaching. I'm going from memory here, so again, some trad's probably going to look that up in Denzinger. Oh, it's not actually in. Well, it doesn't matter if it is specifically in Denzinger because it is part of the ordinary magisterial teaching. I'm pretty sure that it is, but I'm just going from memory here. I don't have Denzinger right in front of me. But the reason I would say read that is because he isn't necessarily writing that to, it's not just about, oh, you're trying to promote Roman Catholicism. No, I'm not. I'm pointing out that it's a great summation of what modernism is, and modernism is the same poison for orthodoxy or for any traditional religious perspective, right? It's the same stuff. And what he outlines is the idea that basically everything is in a process of evolution. So doctrines evolve, truth evolves, morals evolve, religion evolves, the church evolves, the Bible evolves. And so it's closely, you could say, connected to the ideas of Darwin and Darwinism. And if you read Pacendi, it's I'll actually just put the encyclical into the chat, because we'll notice that all of these things that you see him list forth are actually the things that we see in the Roman Catholic Church winning out, right? The irony is that this is at the Vatican website, and when you read it, everything that he says is a damnable heresy is the very thing that the popes of today, especially Francis, teach. So read Pacendi, and you will see that this is from, what year is this? I don't know. It's not listed on here what the year is, but you will see that the Roman Catholic Church completely capitulated to that clearly, because everything he says is the norm in Roman Catholicism now. And for Orthodox, we could take this as a warning. Even though we're not Roman Catholics, we can look at the example of the Roman Catholic Church capitulating to modernism and capitulating to everything that's in his encyclical 100 years, around 1900, 1904, somewhere in there. I don't remember the exact year of it. But if we capitulate, we will have the same problems, right? We are tempted with the exact same thing that the Roman Catholic Church was tempted with and capitulated to. So that's what modernism is. It's the idea that everything is just evolving. And that would mean that there isn't, you can't look back to Nicaea. Nicaea is not going to tell you something, because Nicaea was true for that time. Now, that was a bunch of guys in the ancient world, and they didn't have access to, the science that we have now. They didn't know Darwin. They didn't know about everything evolving, and they were primitive dummies. And so now we're sophisticated, and, we can do textual scholarship, and we can realize that, they just got everything wrong.
And aside from that, just to mention so that people don't fall onto the opposite side of the dialectic, is it is also good to avoid the hyper traditions. There's a lot of Roman Catholics that do that, right? They put politics in the forefront and religion behind. They politics is what they really excel at. I'm not really going to talk smack about a particular person. Some people might have some people in mind, but a lot of people in the Roman Catholic world, as I said, they really do prioritize politics. And we will ultimately say, as Orthodox Christian, is that because there is a symphony, and because Orthodoxy has teachings on the social sphere as well, or political ideology ultimately should be Orthodox Christianity. It shouldn't be a specific thing, but rather Orthodox Christianity itself should be the political ideology that we support, and aspects of Orthodox Christianity in the social sphere and affecting people. That's ultimately what we should be, I think, supporting, outside of and of course this will naturally mean monarchy and other stuff. But anything, the priority here that I'm talking about is spreading the gospel, is spreading the Orthodox
The priorities are
gospel.
wrong.
That's
In Roman Catholicism.
exactly.
Right.
And so another heresy that a lot of people fall into, and we talk about this a lot, is Marcionism. The importance of the Old Testament, New Testament continuity is very, very huge, and there's a reason why Marcionism is one of the earliest heresies.
Yeah.
Right? It's because one of the first things and first foundational things that the Gnostics try to tackle in the Orthodox Church, and to kind of like talk about the Gnostics themselves. This is because I think this is very important. This kind of talks about the connection that Gnosticism has with Protestantism, actually. There's multiple different groups of Gnosticism. There's certain Gnostics that make up their own gospels, right? That's how you have it.
David? Hello?
Remove gospel books. Hello? Yeah, I'm still here.
I lost
You
you
can
for a
hear me?
second there. You were talking about gospel books. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the first group is basically people that add books to the biblical canon. The second group are those people that remove books from the biblical canon, and the reason why is that it goes against their worldview, right? So Marcionism is an example of that. It's removing the entirety of the Old Testament because it goes against Marcion's own worldview. And the third group are those people who keep the gospel as it is, but they have a completely different interpretation. This would remind a lot of people of Islam, for example, right? They kind of had that sort of a view where they look at Christianity, they look at Orthodox, and they say, well, the Bible is indeed a holy book. Some of the Muslim groups today will say this, but your interpretation is completely wrong. And what I'm trying to get here is that Marcionism is in the same group of, in terms of foundation, is still in the same group of Protestantism. Ultimately speaking, both groups have a certain worldview, have certain theological doctrines, and any book, any canonical book that goes against those doctrines, they don't try to change their doctrines. They don't say, I guess I was wrong. No, what they say is those books are not inspired. They're not canon, and they remove it. That's why, for example, Martin Luther tried to remove the book of James,
Right.
because James talked about faith being dead without works, and so that completely went against his. But it was too difficult for him to do. So Marcionism is very deeply entrenched in the sense that I would say Protestantism is a extension of Marcionism, and so if we let Marcionism grow, it will eventually Protestantize our religion. That's why defending creationism is very important. That's why defending Old Testament continuity is very important, and that it's the foundation of Christianity. The foundation of Christianity rests on really the continuity of the Old Testament and New Testament. Us being the successors of the Old Covenant Judaism, us being the true Jews, basically, in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is why, Irenaeus, Marcionism comes up early on against heresies in Irenaeus, and Irenaeus goes into great length to show that the God of the Old Testament is the exact same God of the New Testament. Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. Duh, right? And once you understand that, it makes Marcionism absolutely impossible. So if that's the case, then that undercuts a lot of these errors and a lot of these heresies. And ultimately, the mistake that we mentioned earlier about Father Freeman is demonstrated to be wrong. Or it's demonstrated to be a version of Marcionism as well. Like, the Old Testament has these difficult passages, and so the solution is to say that it's not really history, it's like a bunch of myths or something. It's like a bunch of symbols and allegories and all this kind of nonsense. But if you look at the way Jesus treats the Old Testament, he treats them as history, right? Jesus says Adam and Eve were actual historical people. Jesus treats the events of Genesis as real, as historical, as, Abraham was real, on and on and on, and Paul as well. So in other words, when you start with that little crack of, I'm not going to believe that Abraham and Genesis and the genealogies and that they're actually historical things, they're just kind of myths and stories. What happens is that you're not initially being consistent, then you're later forced to admit that, when the New Testament reads those things as historical, it's also incorrect. So now, in order to keep your unbelieving presuppositions, you're now denying the New Testament as well. And many of them will just say, yeah, okay, sure, whatever. Jesus got it wrong. We that's the text. Those texts about Jesus are not right. Paul had a misunderstanding, and he was, this ancient superstitious guy. Well, now you're a modernist. That's modernism. Modernism says we know better now because of refrigerators and Darwin. We can look back and we can say Paul didn't understand that Genesis is just a bunch of allegories. He thought it was real. Ha ha ha! How superstitious. But if you're interested, I have this had 17,000 views. I have a long 3-hour talk. I'll put it in the text here about refuting Marcionism, showing the continuity of the Old and New Testament, which is everywhere in the Church Fathers. They're always pointing out the continuity between the Old and New Testament and refuting Marcionism. As we said, Marcion is mentioned in the Confession of St. Sophronius, accepted at the Sixth Council. You have to reject Marcion, and you have to believe in the veracity of the Old Testament. If you don't, you're a heretic. And in most of the people in the churches nowadays, because they went to universities where they were taught higher criticism, they were taught the documentary hypothesis, they just assume higher criticism is true. Oh, and if you deny higher criticism, you're a fundamentalist. No, that's not true. So is everybody at the Sixth Council fundamentalists? And if they are, I want to be a fundamentalist. I want to be with those guys. Don't want to be with you.
If someone accused me of fundamentalism, I'll just say, yeah, what's wrong with it?
Yeah,
I mean,
why is
obviously
that wrong?
we're not. Yeah, like what's wrong with believing in the Bible? What's wrong with believing in the Church Fathers? What's wrong with believing in our own religion? If that's fundamentalism, right. I'm the biggest fundamentalist.
Yeah, exactly. So how many more do we have here? You want to do what? What's
just
next?
one. Yeah, just one. Like Christology, like simple Christological mistakes people do, and then we can move on to people that we will like to promote, people that like we will recommend.
Okay.
You check out for good advice. So, I think this will be a good time to basically go over basic Christology, because a lot of people they get they have crypto-Nestorian views. So, for example, why do we not worship the Sacred Heart of Christ? Like, what's the basis of us not worshiping? Well, the basis is actually in the 12 Anathemas of St. Cyril to Nestorius. Now, you might say, well, isn't that specifically for Nestorius? Didn't St. Cyril himself say that? Of course, but the logic of the 12 Anathemas still applies. So the 8th Anathema is very specific when it says that we give one worship and one adoration to Christ. This also is connected to Eucharistic adoration. Now, these practices, they didn't exist in the time of St. Cyril, but it still refutes the argument of Sacred Heart. Ultimately, Sacred Heart is giving a second doxology. Now, think of it this way. One of the heresies of Nestorius was giving a separate doxology to the humanity of Christ, right? So there's a separate doxology of the divinity and a separate doxology of the humanity. Now, that's heresy, but in Roman Catholicism, what you have is that you have a component of the human nature being worshipped. If worshiping the human nature, human aspect is as separate from the divinity is heretical, then think of how big of a heresy worshiping a component of his humanity is. And so I think it's a direct refutation of the Sacred Heart heresy. And unfortunately, we even see some Antiochian Western Rite parishes adopting that practice when they should not have. But this is, if you look at the history of this practice, it's crazy. But anyway, Christologically speaking, why does it matter that there's only one doxology of Christ? Well, ultimately, it's because he's a single person, right? If you have two separate doxology, if you're worshiping two separate aspects of Christ, you're basically dividing him into two.
Right.
And that's one of the points that St. Cyril made against Nestorius.
Right.
Now, we don't go to the opposite route and go, oh, that means monophysitism is true because there's one nature. Well, actually, no, I tackled this in a lot of my videos, in my video on Miaphysis and Diophysis, and and one mistake that I think a lot of people make is about composite hypostasis. Now, St. Cyril is on record that he does refer to the hypostasis as composite, but what does it mean that Christ's hypostasis is composite? And we even dealt with this in the first stream. Well, it's when they're talking about composite hypostasis, both Nestorians and Oriental heterodox actually have the same view. But the place of difference where they differ is about it being analogical to the union, to the hypostatic union, and so on and so forth. But the point that I want to try to make is that one mistake that people make in regards to Orientalism is that when you're speaking about the composite hypostasis as if the hypostasis itself is composite, what you're really saying is that the pre-incarnate Christ as a person is a different person post-incarnate.
Right.
And that is the the consequence of composite hypostasis in the Orientalist in that sense. And what's really important, this concept I think is very important, is enhypostatization.
Right.
So when we're talking about the natures of Christ, what Saint Cyril says is that we believe that Christ is in two natures. That's his qualification for the in two natures formula. He says that these should be natural properties, which we believe, and that it is in two natures according to the intellect. What does that really mean? As I mentioned in the video, it's talking about enhypostatization, and Saint Cyril himself used this concept. Leontius of Jerusalem used this concept against the Severance, and this is completely lost in Orientalist theology. And what we're talking about is that we're speaking of Christ and hypostatizing those two natures. So when we're talking about those two natures, we're referring to the powers that Christ has. And what are we referring to? We're referring to the wills, we're referring to the energies of Christ. Yep. And you don't have the energies of Christ in Roman Catholicism, for example. And we're referring to the powers that Christ has, the faculties that Christ has because of those two natures. Ultimately speaking, the natures are not just some abstract thought. And nature doesn't exist if it's not hypostatized. Exactly. That's why unicorn nature doesn't exist, because there is no unicorn hypostasis. There's a unicorn out there. So it's just in thought. Whereas in Christ, we speak of one person. The natures are only in thought because he hypostatized those two natures. And I'm only referring to these things because there's a lot of like when they look at the controversy of Nestorianism, a lot of people think of it like very simply. They just, it's just, Christ's one person, is divine human, that's it. Yeah, that's really simple. But then they still commit the errors of Nestorianism. And I think it's very important that we kind of distinguish that and also show why the doctrine of energies also matter.
Yeah. I would highly recommend, if you do want to go down this route, to read the McGuckin book about St. Cyril and the Christological controversy. And if you do have God, History, and Dialectic, Volume 1, you will find this discussed on page 229, 230, 231, 232, 233, 234, 235, 236, 237, where you get the refutation of Severus of Antioch and how Leontius of Jerusalem is the key figure for really crystallizing what inhypostatize means, and how the humanity of Christ itself is impersonal and doesn't have a hypostasis in itself, but in virtue of the incarnation, it is inhypostatized, and so it has for its personhood the divine person of the Logos. So that's the solution to a lot of the stupid disputes that we've had in the last year, people being hard-headed, not knowing what they're talking about. And also the entirety of Book 3 of John Damascus. The entirety of Book 3 essentially rehearses these debates from the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, and he puts them in a very clear and concise manner. Let's see. I don't know if I had anything else on that point.
And
go ahead.
And just as a small note, a lot of this is kind of like a basic response that Orientalists make, and I just want to talk about it. Then we can move on to recommended people and so on and so forth. When we're talking about monothelitism in Severus' system, a lot of people will give quotes and they will say, "Oh, but he says that Christ has human will and divine will and salvific suffering." Well, that's because he believes in two different manifestations of wills, but that doesn't mean that he actually believes in two wills. And as a matter of fact, there was a dispute over this with another monophysite, and he said, "Why do you believe in two different manifestations? Like, if we really believe in what we believe, then shouldn't there only be a single manifestation?" And that's actually one of the disputes that Severus had with another monophysite. He doesn't ultimately believe in two wills. He believes that we see two wills because there's manifestations of wills. But ultimately speaking, when we're talking about Christ, he doesn't have two wills. There's only one will, because another reason why is because if the number two signifies division. So we have another example of distinction equaling division, this time in the Orientalist thought. And I will say that's why they don't really have the same doctrine of energies that we have. I just want to make that note.
If you read the Disputation with Pyrrhus, you'll see that multiple times throughout the debate, it's all premised on the presupposition that distinction entails division or composition, and that there's a natural tension between the will of God and the will of man. And that's why they can't really understand the issue or the debate about gnomic will. And so this is a great way to ultimately refute the Orientals, is to understand that the debate, the dispute, evolves out of the 4th century from Chalcedon up into debates about whether will and energy are properties of nature or property of person. And they're properties of nature, which is the correct position.
And also, the Batrelos book on Byzantine Christ is very good on this topic too. I will highly recommend. So that covers basically everything. And should we talk about people that we actually like, that we think that people should listen to, or should we get to that now? Yeah. So the first, naturally, it's going to be us. That's going to be the first group of people. Follow us, listen to us, trust us. Ortho Christian, I mentioned them before, and as I said, there's a good aspect of in terms of news coverage. Sometimes I myself have seen that sometimes they don't really have been too honest. They haven't really been honest, but generally speaking, when it comes to articles, when it comes to writings about saints, they're very solid, and you won't you'll be 100% sure that they're completely orthodox in terms of what they're preaching, in terms of theology, in terms of orthodoxy. Another person that I like is Seraphim Hamilton, and you had him as well on your show, correct?
Yeah, we did a talk on Genesis a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so what I really like about Seraphim Hamilton, Kabane on YouTube, is that he's very honest. Like, if he really has an issue, he will openly say it. So he's very intellectually honest. And the only criticism that I will have is that he's very, in his theology, he's very, not incredibly, he does believe in essence, energy distinction and crucial orthodox dogmas, but he is very, he has a very, he's basically the opposite of Romanides in that sense. But outside of that, he's very solid. I will recommend checking out Seraphim Hamilton. He has very good works on Genesis, both in terms of theology, right? Creationism in terms of theology, creationism in terms of comparing the scientific worldview. And as I said, he'll be completely honest with his views, right? And another person, which you'll agree with me on, Jay, is Father Chris Moody. He does have a YouTube channel. I'm subscribed to him, and I think you should too. He has very good talks. He's very orthodox. I believe he's been influential for you, Jay, as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Father Chris is great.
Yeah, and you won't get wrong. Father Spiridon is amazing. And if you want content in regards to spirituality, right, Orthodox spirituality, Father Spiridon is your best bet. He's incredibly good. He has very solid content. It's not long. It's generally 7 minutes, 10 minutes, sometimes 4 minutes. And he covers basic stuff, but the stuff he does is very valuable. And hopefully Father Spiridon does more of those contents, because I think we need it. Another priest is Father... Oh, I need some water. Hold on. I'm losing my voice.
It's okay. I'll read a couple super chats while you're doing that. Dalton for $5. Orthodox academics say that Genesis describes real events, but not in a one-to-one literal sense. They are full of it. Well, I mean, this is kind of like academic speak to muddy the waters. What does it mean not in a one-to-one sense? I mean, we have hermeneutical principles that are come to us from the church fathers on how to interpret different types of texts, like historical, allegorical, simile, metaphor, poetry, psalms, liturgy, prophetic texts, historical books. I mean, you look at the different types of works that are present, and then you're going to interpret them accordingly. But again, we have a whole book that's essentially summarizing the patristic view of Genesis and their hermeneutic here by Father Rose, which I highly recommend, Genesis, Creation, Early Man. So it doesn't really matter what so-called Orthodox academics say. We don't submit the church to what the academics tell us. The church is under the purview of bishops and the tradition of the church, period. It doesn't matter what the academics say. I mean, we can be academic in the sense of being scholarly. There's nothing wrong with that. Many of the church fathers, many of the great pillars of the church were scholars. That's not the problem. The problem is assuming that modern men who are unbelievers are the authorities by which we submit our theology to them. We don't do that. They're not our authority. Danny, 490. Right. Go ahead.
I'm back. I got my voice back. I was just my take on the question is, I think a good litmus test is basically asking them, do you believe Genesis happened? Do you believe what Moses wrote actually really happened? And Another thing to distinguish is that a lot of people make this mistake. Just because something has allegory or something symbolism in it doesn't mean that it didn't actually happen. A lot of things that happen in reality does have symbolic meaning, and it's both. It's basically both, right? Something can really happen and have symbolic meaning, typological meanings that carry on in the New Testament. And I can finish the recommended people list. It's kind of short. Father Josiah Trenham, Patristic Nectar Publications. Father Josiah is amazing. He's very solid. He has very good takes on contemporary issues. I've seen some people, for example, he's very pro Jordan Peterson, but he won't like treat Jordan Peterson as a gospel. He just likes Jordan Peterson. But outside of that, like anything Father Josiah says is amazing. He has very good insights on modern culture, and is a person I will say that you could trust. Father Deacon Ananias, obviously, and I kind of want to just dedicate this part for Father Deacon Ananias. He needs to attend a certain event, I believe it's called Sophia, and unfortunately California legislation doesn't like it when you don't support LGBT marriage. So they completely blocked the funds. And this is from Father Deacon Ananias himself. He said all of this on Facebook and on Discord and so on. And so he needs donations. He needs $1,000. And so I will basically ask everyone, I'm not going to force you anything, but I will basically ask anyone, even if it's something small like $5, I think you should donate to Father Deacon Ananias. It's going to be great.
This is real, by the way. So I'll be going to this same event. So I know he's talking about a real event. It's not.
Yeah.
I did put his PayPal. If anybody wants to, and I'll take some of these proceeds here and I'll direct it to his PayPal. But if you see the link there, if you want to chip in some for his PayPal, go ahead.
Yeah, it will just be great. I mean, the outcome of that conference, I no doubt it's going to be amazing. But I'm not going to dive into the details or speculate because it's kind of like a special conference. Another person, well, I think we need to talk about him, dedicate him in another chapter because Joseph Farrell is very important because a lot of people, when we talk about Farrell and his great work, God, History, Dialectic, a lot of people make these arguments that, but he has other works that's like completely. So we kind of need to like, it's kind of common sense and we already agree on it. But in terms of earlier works and Orthodox Christian works, back when he was a teacher in a seminary, stuff like the translating the works of Saint Photius, translating the works of Saint Maximus. His great work, God, History, Dialectic, we will recommend that. Anything, all the Gnostic stuff afterwards, after his apostasy, unfortunately, we will not recommend, obviously. So he has a bunch of silly stuff written. Obviously, we're going to say that you shouldn't read that. It's a bunch of nonsense. But it's like Tertullian, right? Tertullian had a lot of good writings when he was Orthodox, but ultimately Tertullian ended up becoming a heretic. And it's kind of the same deal with Joseph Farrell. His work, God, History, Dialectic, is amazing, but we don't deny the fact that he has apostatized and he has gone off to the deep end, obviously, in that sense. So I think that kind of needs to be said so that people don't misrepresent what we think of his work and end up just slandering us. Another YouTube channel I would like to recommend is Orthodox Talks by priest monk Father Cosmas. He's from Australia. He has very long talks on spiritual matters, and I listen to certain talks of his, and he's very solid. He's very orthodox. He tries to explain things in detail, and he has a very good emphasis on spirituality. I will definitely recommend checking him out if you have the time to listen to his talks. They last for 3 hours, 2 hours, so these are pretty long talks. There's a YouTube channel called Orthodox Church. That covers the basic news and certain videos. It's basically like the what goes on in the world of Orthodoxy. That's the YouTube channel that you should check out. Antisagian Films has really good content. One of their videos is on Saint John of Damascus. Very good video. They have videos explaining saints and their lives, and basics on certain Orthodox views on life, etc., etc. So that's also another YouTube channel that we will like to recommend and say, you should check these out instead of all of these heretics. And in terms of, now that we talked about, this is kind of the last thing, but we talked about Bishop Ware. and him
And
being
Father
for the
Peter
mind. Now, a lot
hears.
of people will say,
Father Peter hears, as I said.
Oh yeah, Father Peter hears is also. I forgot to add him here. Yeah, Father Peter hears is also pretty good. Um, and a lot of people say, well, what about his book, The Orthodox Way, right? That's kind of like the introduction book for Orthodoxy. I will recommend, right? We're not just going to say, oh, don't read that. I'm going to recommend Law of God by Father Daniel Sisoev. He's a very solid person. I think he's definitely going to be canonized. I think he's definitely a saint. And his catechism book, The Law of God, is very solid. It's very good. I will say it's probably better than the Orthodox way. It's basically catechism, and it's also the catechism of Saint Philaret, the longer catechism that's on J. Dyer's reading list. I will recommend you check that out. That's a great catechism. It's basically a question answer sort of catechism. And that will be all for recommended people. Do you have anything to add, or should we just move on to the super chats?
No, we can move on.
All right, so we can just move on to the super chats because that covers everyone that I would like to recommend, unless you have anyone in mind.
Right. So next says Danny for $5. Do you have any thoughts on Peter Mogila and his confession of faith? Some regard him as a Westerner influenced by Catholicism. Thanks. He is revered in multiple churches as a saint, so he's kind of like Saint Gennadius Scholarios, who tried to give as much way as he could to the Latins, to the Westerns, to try to bring them back. So he was an opponent of Uniatism, so we appreciate that. I don't necessarily see a problem using their language as long as we keep. The problem isn't using the language. The problem is keeping the meanings the same. So, you have Hieromonk Damascene trying to look at the Tao and the eternal Tao and try to find meanings that could bring Far Eastern people into Orthodoxy. There's nothing wrong with doing that in the right way. You just have to be careful that we don't, like we've talked about, fall into the word concept fallacy where we think that, oh, well, if we use the words, then they all mean the same thing. And we're all just saying the same thing. And that's not the case. So I don't necessarily have a problem with either. I mean, if Gennadios had not said that we can never accept Aquinas's rejection of essence energy distinction, right, his teaching of absolute divine simplicity, then we would have to reject Gennadios. But since he says that, we know that he wasn't trying to give us a false union with Roman Catholics. So I would say the same thing is probably true with this Peter and his confession of faith. But it is true that after this, because of Peter the Great, Peter the Tsar, that is, Russia did get a lot of influence from the West, right? And we know that Peter was not a good guy. So that was a tragic thing. It was unfortunate, and it took many centuries for Russia to recover from that Latin influence. Do you have any thoughts on Peter Mohila and his confession of faith?
Yeah, I've heard of him. I mean, I haven't really heard bad things about it. That's all I'm gonna say. I don't really know much about Saint Peter Mogila, but I don't think like there's bound to be going to be like westernized, quote unquote westernized saints. But ultimately speaking, I mean, the fact that he's canonized, I think argues to me that he's Orthodox. I mean, I'm not going to go against canonizations in the church.
Yeah. We're going to talk, let's see, Richard Rawl, $5. Thank you guys both for your work. Jay, your Discord has been a great place for me to learn about Orthodoxy, my Western presuppositions, and for Ortho-Bro camaraderie. Well, thank you, Dick. We're glad that you enjoy it and that it has brought you to Orthodoxy. Props to you and props to the shout outs and the support through the super chats. Anaxon 5 Canadian. I love you both and thank you for staying consistent. Well, thank you. We appreciate you and we hope that we stay consistent. So keep praying for us. ML's back, $5. He says, in the condemnation of Origen, is the condemnation of Origen in book 14 of the post-Nicene Fathers set? I can't find it in the Sixth Council. Do you have a page that you referenced, right? So if you have the Church Fathers set and you have volume 7 on the Ecumenical Councils, you'll notice that the condemnation of Origen is only in the Fifth Council in this set and reaffirmed again on page 549 of the Seventh Council. So what I mentioned, as I think I already explained it, but you have to have the Confession of St. Sophronius is not listed in the Philip Schaff set. So it's a separate book, unfortunately, printed by Oxford Press, but it is accepted by the Sixth Council as an Orthodox confession. So that's the solution to that. Let's see, where's the next one? Doorman, $365. In my parish library, Father John Bear edits half of the books. He is linked to Vladimir Seminary. That place seems very modernist. Yes, unfortunately, St. Vladimir's has gone in a more and more modernist direction. It doesn't mean that everybody there is bad or everybody's ill motives or anything like that. Not saying that, but I think Father Bear is, again, associated with Fordham, and he does appear to be an ecumenist. So, again, doesn't mean that every book from St. Vladimir's is bad, but you have to watch out. Joan Norton, $20. Thank you, Joan. Do you have anything to say about Bear or St. Vladimir's?
Oh yeah, I was gonna mention. I posted this on Twitter. So there is an instance where the triads were translated by Father Meyendorff, and Father Meyendorff omitted certain things that Saint Gregory Palamas said because it's rhetoric and polemical, and so he basically removed the rhetorical and polemical stuff from Saint Gregory Palamas. So right. I think that's kind of worrying. I mean, there's still a lot of things of worth to check out, but it's hard to trust the editors when they don't see any problems in omitting certain writings that they made in their own discretion, right? Ultimately, we don't really know what they removed. Maybe in those polemical statements, he was making an argument that we could be using even today, right? Why is he, or maybe it's just is making a statement that, for example, will be against ecumenism or whatever. So it's kind of hard to trust that when that sort of stuff is going on. And Meyendorff himself is admitting that he did that. So that unfortunately does happen.
Yeah, I said that years ago to an Orthodox priest, the one that I debated on the civil state, and he said that I was making that up, that Meyendorff didn't say that. Do you have where Meyendorff said that?
Let me check. I saw it from another Discord user. Let me see.
Well, all right, we can dig that up in the Discord. That's okay.
Yeah, we can dig it up.
So let's see who's next. Dalton for $2. I'm going to answer why I don't like that stuff, Dalton. Number one, that is a serpent. They promote the serpent seed at that stupid internet radio thing. So obviously we're not going to promote serpent seed stuff, and we're not going to talk about that. So we're going to skip that. Elias Gomez, $2. I was blocked yesterday on Instagram, and I was hoping to get unblocked. Are you the libertarian guy who was talking about who believes in libertarian stuff? That's probably why you got blocked if you were touting Calvinism or Protestant libertarian crap. So if you want to put your Instagram into the chat, I'll try to unblock it, but I don't remember who you were or why I blocked you. Destructive Stone Lake, but thank you for that $2. Destructive Stone Lake, $10. How do the unsaved continue to experience spiritual death if death is ultimately put to death and free will is choice between multiple goods? Can we hope all will ultimately become saved? I don't think that we have any reason to hope that all will be saved, because we have many statements from Jesus that not all people will be saved. So death is used in multiple senses in Scripture. So sometimes it's speaking of spiritual death, sometimes it's speaking of physical death. And if you read the Apocalypse, sometimes it's talking about the second death, which is the death of putting yourself into a state of eternal death, right? So even though your nature is resurrected, if you're wicked in the resurrection, you can still have a bad experience of God because you never loved God. So I'm not sure if you mean, I guess I don't, do the wicked in the eschaton retain free will to choose the good? I don't think so. I don't think that you can choose to move out of a state of rejection of God in the eschaton to salvation. It is true that some people have hoped for that, and some saints have thought that perhaps, but we don't go by some of these minority views and opinions by some saints. I just don't think that there's we're not given any revelation to believe that we can hope that all people will ultimately be saved. So that's my view. What do you think, David?
There's also a book called Apocalypse of Peter that actually touts that line, and that book was rejected for many different reasons, and I think that was one of the reasons why it was rejected, because Apocalypse of Peter, it claims that Jesus gave a secret revelation to Peter where he says that everyone will eventually be saved, everyone will eventually go to heaven. And that's actually one of the arguments that universalists use. They will say that, this was in the Moratorian canon. Therefore, it's canonical, it's inspired, because it used to be in the ancient early church canon. Well, first of all, you don't believe in the ancient early church, otherwise you'd be Orthodox. Second of all, even that will be subject to interpretation. But even in that case, it has been rejected by the church. So the only like arguments I've seen from hoping that everyone will be saved is pretty much from that book, basically, from Apocalypse of Peter, which I don't think any saint regard it as canon. I might be wrong, but I don't think I've seen that. Like after Nicaea, I haven't seen any saints regarding it as an inspired book. So it was rejected at Nicaea.
Okay, so Emil asks a good question in the next section for $10. He says, "What does the Fifth Council mean when it uses the phrase 'only in the onlooker's mind' when discussing Christ's two natures in the seventh anathema? Sounds like Christ's two natures are distinguished only virtually." That's correct, because after the incarnation, it is always improper to speak of any real separation between him in any sense. The only sense in which we do speak of a separation is virtually or logically distinct. That's why the hypostatic union is a henotic union, according to St. Cyril. You can't ever posit that he was really divided. And so if you look at the second anathema of this council, you see that it's directed against Nestorius. So the anathemas of Constantinople II, 553, are actually dealing with not just monophysitism, but also Nestorianism. And so when you come to anathema 7, and it says that if anyone uses the expression "in two natures" and does not confess that our one Lord Jesus Christ has been revealed in the divinity and in the humanity, so as by that expression to express a difference of natures, of which an ineffable unity is inconfusibly made, a union which neither the nature of the Word was changed, so notice that he underwent no change when he became incarnate, into that of the flesh, nor the flesh into that of the Word, so he retains his two natures after the union. For each remained what it was by nature, but the union being hypostatic, right? The hypostasis is not a product of the union. It's what he had prior to the union, and it's that divine hypostasis, assuming he's a divine person with a divine nature, assuming human nature. And then he goes on to say, "We shall take the expression to regard the mystery of Christ in a sense as to divide the parties." After the hypostatic union, Christ is never divided. Even in the death of Christ, his human nature is not divided from him. We can speak of him, as St. John Damascus says, in terms of two natures, even after the incarnation, but that's only logically. He's not actually divided when we speak of him. Even in his death, as John Damascus says in Book 3, the soul of Christ is separated from the human body. The human nature is not separated from the divinity. That's heretical. So there's no actual separation. The only thing that's separated in the death is the human soul from the human body, both of which are properties of the human nature, you see. So there's no actual separation of the two natures, divine and human, in Christ, even in the death. That's why John Damascus says that the human soul, when it's separated from the human body and descends into Hades, the only personal subject of his soul is the divine person of the Logos.
Also, I have a couple of things to add there. First of all,
and by the way, the last phrase, of Anathema 7 shows you that it's talking about Nestorianism, to divide the natures or to make of them persons.
I was gonna add a couple of things. Like, first of all, that's the into natures only in the onlooker's mind. That's actually the first time it appeared. Is not actually in the Fifth Council. That actually did appear in Chalcedon. That's in the Council of Chalcedon, which is a very good argument against the Oriental heterodox, because they think that we use the strict Antiochian formula. We don't use the strict Antiochian formula. We use the formula that Saint Kirill made qualifications for, and every single qualifications he used, we use, and one of those qualifications is exactly that. And as I mentioned before, it talks about those natures also being hypostatized. And this is an argument that Leontius of Jerusalem made against Severus of Antioch, right? He said certain monophysites said, well, the two natures only exist according to the intellect. And Leontius said, yes, you're correct. Do you see the natures? Do you see the divine nature? Do you see the human nature? No, you see a person. And that's the argument that he made. You see a person, Jesus Christ. But he hypostatizes those two natures, meaning that those natures, they only exist in the sense that Christ as a person exists. Not to say that his hypostasis is changed or became human, but they exist in the mode of a person.
Right. Exactly.
That's what it's talking about.
That's,
and that's
Emil, you would want to read this book, as I said, St. Cyril and of Alexandria and the Christological Controversy, and you would also benefit from Byzantine Christ by Bathrellos. We do have those, the PDF of the Bathrellos one in the Discord, because that book is like $200. But yeah, thank you, David. That was a good answer.
So that will be pretty much it. But I would like to repeat that that qualification is in the Council of Chalcedon, and it completely refutes and destroys the Oriental heterodox because they completely ignore that aspect of Chalcedon.
Yes, Destructive Stone Lake for $7. What do you think of the Western Rite, and are there any tendencies towards ecumenism? Yes, this is one of the problems, and we have Lewis is in the Discord. Great guy, Lewis. Shout out to Lewis, and he's in the UK. So the Western Rite that he's been involved in the UK is not the same thing necessarily as what's in the US. In the US, there's a lot of problems in this. I don't think it's inherently wrong, but the problem is that they want to try to appeal to people who are, friends of the Latin Mass, or Anglicans who like the Latin liturgy. And the problem is that they will try to import these things that are not Orthodox, like heart worship. You can't import Sacred Heart of Jesus into Orthodoxy because it's Nestorian, as we covered earlier. You can't separate the worship of Christ into different parts of Jesus. It's crazy. And it's a Jesuit Nestorian mistake to do that. It's the Jesuits who came up with that. So that's the problem. The problem with the Western Rite is not the rite itself. It's just that the people who do it sometimes are quacks or non-canonical, or if they're canonical, they want to try to import these heretical Roman Catholic doctrine. They don't even know, the people that are doing it don't even know why it's Nestorian. So that's the problem. Destructive Stone Lake again. He says, do you have any opinion on Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Heiser, and his Unseen Realm Divine Council? Yeah, I've interacted with that for years. He used to subscribe to Jay's analysis for many years. I've read the Divine Council. Yeah, it's biblical. Nothing wrong with that. I don't agree with his Protestantism.
I was going to say something about the Western Rite, by the way. So there's important things to mention about the Western Rite. So, for example, there are saints that do support a Western Rite. Doesn't mean that they support the Western Rite that we have in the Antiochian Church, for example, today, but they do support a Western Rite in order to, have more appeal for people to Orthodoxy. But what's really important is that there are certain issues with the Western Rite that certain churches have. So Antiochian Western Rite, I will definitely say, is very heretical in some of the practices they have. I have heard that they refer to Thomas Aquinas as a saint even in their prayer books, in some of the prayer books at least. I saw this from a Western Rite on Twitter, and he was very happy about it. And anyone that asked, why are you happy about it? Thomas Aquinas is not a saint nor church. He blocked those people. So it was kind of a weird instance. But in some aspect, it is tendencies towards ecumenism. But in some other aspects, it's actually kind of the opposite of ecumenism. You really have to... there needs to be a good, accurate Western Rite really applied in Orthodoxy, if there's going to be one in the first place. And as Jay mentioned, Eucharistic adoration, Sacred Heart, these are regular things in Antiochian Western Rite parishes, and it really should stop. I mean, I've heard even unleavened bread is being used. I've heard. And if that's really the case, then
nonsense.
That's very worrying. Then, because that's, for people that don't know, leavened bread, unleavened bread, that dispute is actually one of the foundational reasons why the 1054 schism even happened. That's one of the main disputes that the Constantinopolitan Patriarch had with the Roman Patriarch.
Yep. Shauna Sawyer sends $20. Thank you very much, Shauna Sawyer. All right, so we're coming to the end of the stream. A lot of great questions. Thank you guys so much. And if you would subscribe to Daniel, David, I've got his channel linked in the bio. And then if you want to support Father Deacon Dr. Ananias to go to that conference due to the weird California law, you can also chip into his PayPal if you want to there. And be sure and subscribe and like and share below if you enjoyed this. And anything else you want to add, David?
Just thank you all for listening in. And I don't really have anything to add. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you have a blessed day. And everyone for the old calendar, everyone on the old, aka the real calendar. Just kidding. Everyone on the old calendar, I mean, I hope you have a blessed upcoming Christmas, upcoming nativity feast. And yeah, that's it.
Cool beans. All right. I'm supposed to be on with the Tech War guys tonight, so that will be a fun interview. He said he wanted to do it tonight, but I haven't heard back from him yet today. So hopefully that'll go through and can have a good conversation with the dudes over at Tech Wars. So everybody have a good evening, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you for coming on, David.
My pleasure.